Chapter 261, Flawed System. It took a few moments and it drained a considerable amount of power, but the rain stopped and the clouds slowly thinned. Tapping his wand on his robes, he drew out the water in them before letting it fall to the ground with a splash. He repeated this for the rest of his friends since wet clothes made it easier to get sick. "Think the git will get a life sentence?" Ron asked, breaking the silence. "Seems like the sort of thing that would land you a sentence like that," Tracy said seriously. "My father told me once about how ruthless the Ministry is with things like this. Making an example is what he says," Ron said seriously. "Muggles do it too, you know," Nick said quietly. "Zero tolerance policy they call it, punishing folk regardless of the crime severely. It's supposed to keep the regular people in line with the law, but it simply doesn't work very well," he added with a shake of his head. "What do you mean?" Hermione asked with a frown. "Circumstances is what I am talking about. There are 4 types of criminals from what I can tell: lifestyle, malicious, career and accidental. See, lifestyle criminals are those who grew up in it and simply don't know any different. Malicious criminals are those that actively choose to commit crimes because they enjoy it. Career criminals are those who turn to crime out of nothing more than simple greed. The accidental criminals are those that commit a crime accidentally or in a fit of passion and regret it deeply afterwards. In a case involving the exact same crime, each of these criminals gets the exact same punishment regardless of intent or circumstances, and they call it justice. In truth, it simply doesn't work because it doesn't target the crux of the issue for the individual criminal," he explained with a scowl. "Does the Ministry or government know all this?" Ron asked with a worried expression. "They do. My father once mentioned how unjust some of the punishments were after reading the papers in the morning, but I didn't know what he meant until now," Daphne said with a bothered expression. "Why don't they just change the system if it doesn't work?" Hermione asked, genuinely confused. "They can't. Our entire civilization is propped up on this flawed system, and while they might spend years at a time tweaking each individual law to try and get as close as possible to true justice, but it's simply not possible. There is no one-size-fits-all justice that they can implement, hence it's all circumstantial," Nick said honestly. Everyone got quiet at this, as none of them could find a good way to deny what he said, as it made perfect sense. "As for Lockhart, he'll probably be driven mad in no time at all in Azkaban," Nick said with more than a little pleasure at the idea. "Weak-willed people would definitely not maintain their sanity for very long in an environment that constantly saps the happiness out of them." This was very literal in this case, as the Dementors literally ate happiness, so getting sent to Azkaban was a very bad experience. Back to the interrogation of Lockhart, both Dumbledore and Snape had become numb to the anger after listening to Lockhart narrate his long list of crimes. Then there was the old wizard in Romania that was dealing with that coven of vampires. "I posed as a reporter for that one before catching him off guard once I had the full story." The blonde spoke almost passionately about his various conquests while under the effects of Verita serum. By the end of the 2-hour-long interrogation, both Dumbledore and Snape were totally disgusted by Lockhart. "I will contact the Ministry about the official arrest of his while you seek out the boy about the curse. We will also need to find a replacement for the Defense Against the Dark Arts position with haste. I believe the boy had some idea on that matter and thus should be able to assist," Dumbledore said, and Snape nodded before turning to walk out of the room. "And Severus, be understanding with the boy. He may not be in the best state of mind," the old man called out, and besides a small flick of his wrist, Snape made no motion that he heard him. Dumbledore turned to look at the dosed Lockhart with a sigh before knocking him out with a simple stunning charm. "Let's hope this is the last issue we have to deal with for a while," he thought before leaving the man tied up in the room to write the letters he needed in his office. Chapter 262, Snape's Perspective. Snape POV. "I scoffed to myself when the old man told me to treat the young man with understanding as if he was some normal brat. Nicholas Ravenclaw was many things, but normal was not one of them. In his same situation, I very much doubt any other student would have hesitated for a second to either flee in panic or violently attack Lockhart. That he instead turned the man in despite his justifiable anger showed a level of self-control few possess. The thing that concerned me instead was the boy's rapidly growing power. He hid it well, but it showed if you were to pay attention. Small things like the fact most of his spells were overpowered by a large amount. Or even the silent transfigurations he employs without hiding at all. There had even been an increasingly more adept and powerful level to the enchanted items as well. I had noticed it by observing one of the first rings of protection he sold as well as the newest set. The new enchantment was more stable, and I wasn't even sure the boy knew it could now block 2 attacks before crumbling instead of 1. This showed a drastically improved efficiency in the enchantment, which was frightening to say the least. I myself had only seen such a level of improvement in a field twice in my life. The first was myself when I first started to delve into the art of potions and spell work. The second was Lily Evans, whom I still sorely miss. She was the most brilliant magical individual in our generation, with a mind that allowed her to master nearly any field with little effort. She was especially gifted in charms and created dozens of spells from scratch in our time as students. The boy instead was supremely gifted in enchantment and transfiguration and had a not small amount of talent in potions as well. No, talent wasn't the right word to describe his ability in potions, it was almost as if he was intimately familiar with the subject already. I had already figured out how he approached the subject, and though I am loath to admit it, the Muggle knowledge of chemistry did work well in the subject. Unlike most wizards, I did not ignore the prowess that the Muggles had in their sciences and even used some of that information myself. As such, I couldn't help but notice the almost scientific way he approached the brewing of potions. My mind was occupied with these thoughts as I walked through the castle in search of the person in question. It surprised me to find him with the other students he called friends sitting on a bench at the lake's edge. I was even more surprised to see how calm he was, as if his anger had simply evaporated. The boy glanced at me as I approached, and something about his golden eyes unnerved me as I got stared down. "You'll have to excuse me while I go speak with the professor," the boy said, and his friends looked surprised as they only just noticed me at that moment. He stood up and walked over to where I was standing calmly, but I noticed the wand in his hand. Considering he had already been attacked today, his caution was understandable. "Mufflieto," I spoke, making it impossible to eavesdrop on the conversation. "I was sent to inform you of the need for your assistance in removing the curse on the defense against the dark arts position. I was also told you may be of assistance in finding a suitable replacement for the recently dismissed professor," I said bluntly. The boy didn't look surprised at all to hear what I said, which made sense since all of this was his idea to begin with. "Give me a moment to settle things with my friends and I'll be right along," he said, and I nodded. After the boy handled his friends, we went back into the castle, but not to the defense against the dark arts classroom like I had expected, but rather to the headmaster's office. The boy seemed to have anticipated my confusion and explained the reason behind this action. "I am familiar with the school wards as they are currently, and as a result can't remove the curse without someone familiar with its previous state with me," he said, and I understood what he was talking about. It was like trying to remove an impurity in a potion that you hadn't brewed. You would first need to know what the impurity was before you could focus on removing it, which might require the brewer themselves. "Lemon drops." I spoke the password, which caused the griffin statue to move aside, revealing the stairs to the office. Chapter 263, Options. Nick followed Snape into the office calmly and noticed Dumbledore hunched over his desk writing on a sheet of parchment. The old man seemed to notice them but continued writing for a couple moments before tapping the parchment with his wand. This caused the letter to fold itself and slip into an envelope that he then wrote a name on and handed to Fawkes. "I am terribly sorry for the actions of Gilderoy Lockhart this evening. When I hired him for the position, I truly thought he was harmless if a bit dull," Dumbledore said sincerely. "You reported him to the Ministry already, correct?" Nick asked seriously. "That letter is my report on the matter after Severus and I interrogated the man under verita serum. To think such a foul individual was prancing about so openly," Dumbledore said with a sigh and a shake of his head. "In this regard you ought to be applauded, as without your capture and reporting of him he would likely have gotten away with it," he added on honestly. Nick shook his head. "So long as he gets a proper punishment, I would rather not think of the man, if that's all right with you," he said, and the old goat nodded. "I understand. I take it you are here for the two issues Severus was meant to discuss with you, correct?" Dumbledore asked calmly. Nick nodded. "I need your assistance in removing the curse due to the reason Professor Flitwick has already likely informed you of," he said, and Dumbledore nodded. "As for the matter of the Dada position, there are a few possibilities, in fact," Nick said with the smallest hint of a grin. Both Dumbledore and Snape seemed surprised at this, as they honestly couldn't think of any solutions to this problem, much less several. "What are these options? If it's not too much trouble, explain your reasons as well, as we would very much appreciate it if you did," Dumbledore said with a look of interest. "First is to convince Horace Slughorn to return to Hogwarts as the potions teacher while Professor Snape here takes the defense position. The second is to give hire Sirius Black for the position, since from my understanding of the man he is quite skilled at the subject. Inversely, you could hire Lupin as well for the same reason, so long as I create a werewolf ring for him to have full control of his transformation. The final option, of course, is to hire Alastair Moody for the position, since he is more than qualified," Nick explained with a slightly widening grin. He couldn't help but get excited by the prospect of each of these possible ideas. I can understand myself and Alastair Moody and even Lupin, Snape said, with the final name being especially venomous sounding, but Sirius Black is a terrible choice for the position with his mentality. He finished, clearly upset at the mere idea of sharing space with Sirius. Nick shrugged. While I can understand your hatred of the man due to his past actions, I can also not dismiss his ability from an unbiased standpoint. To be fair though, I believe having you take the position to be the best outcome due to your intimate familiarity with the subject. Nick said honestly. We appreciate your candor in this matter, but this will require serious discussion before a decision is made. Dumbledore said, and Snape nodded ever so slightly. With that settled, I can begin the process of removing the curse if you would be so kind as to show me the affected part of the ward. Nick said, changing the subject. Dumbledore stood up and walked over to the nearby wall that had all the portraits of the previous headmasters on it and tapped it on a specific spot with his wand. Nick took this time to examine the Elder Wand with his magical senses, but felt a slight chill when he found it returning the stare. The Elder Wand possessed intelligence, he thought in horror that he had to fight to keep off his face. This was a very big deal, as it meant whoever had crafted it was way more skilled than even Ollivander. Nick stopped trying to examine the wand and instead focused on the wall that was sliding open to reveal what was the biggest ward stone he had ever heard of. The biggest in recorded history was merely 3 feet squared, but this ward stone was nearly triple that and looked like a very large boulder covered in various runes and enchantments. It glowed so brightly in his magical senses that Nick needed to turn them off entirely to prevent the veins in his nose from bursting at it. Chapter 264, Removing the Curse. Dumbledore tapped the ward stone and a colorful array of magic appeared in mid-air. He then waved his wand, skillfully navigating the huge variety of magics until he came to one specific part. It was dark purple and swirled sinisterly around some of the oldest parts of the magic. Nick took out his wand and placed the tip against his chest above his heart. Per sanguinem meum allegatum gloriam meam futurum videre. By my blood-bound glory, see my future, he spoke, and his heartbeat resounded throughout the room, and the magics of the ward stone resonated with it, adding a blinding white and gold magical imprint to the ward stone. Nick closed his eyes and sucked in a breath of air as he felt the connection to the wards get created. All right, I will isolate the curse now, get ready to rip it out. He said seriously, and Dumbledore nodded with a stern expression as he had the wand pointed at the flowing magic at the ready. Nick slowly started to will his imprint to flow around the imprint left by Voldemort carefully. There was a bit of a delay as it took a moment for his imprint to follow his intent, but it slowly crept around the sinister purple magic. The curse was adaptive, however, and immediately felt a threat to itself from his imprint and lashed out. Nick coughed up blood as the damage to himself recoiled through his connection. He grit his teeth, however, and willed his imprint to fully entrap the curse that continued to attack it. Blood vessels burst in his eyes, nose, and ears, much to the concern of both Snape and Dumbledore, but Nick eventually succeeded in isolating the curse. Do it, he said weakly, and Dumbledore went to work excising the curse like a cancerous tumor. Nick went weak as the curse went through its final fits of resistance before it was removed, and Snape firmly held him up. You've done enough, child, rest now. Take him to Poppy, Dumbledore said, and Snape helped Nick walk out of the office. Once they were gone, the old wizard turned towards the shining magics and looked at the white and golden magic with interest. While the founders had cleverly left this back door for their descendants in secret, it did not mean that the nature of it wasn't recorded. Each imprint was tailor-made for the person who left it and showed the headmaster their true nature. For example, Voldemort's imprint had been fused with a curse that made it clever and violent. Nick's imprint interested Dumbledore greatly, as it was the second best thing to get a firm read on Nick to legilimency. What he found, though, surprised him, as it was not truly white but rather a myriad of colors fused together to appear white like a rainbow. The gold, on the other hand, was different entirely, as it didn't fit any personality trait and he couldn't tell what it meant. Madame Pomfrey, however, when Nick arrived with Snape to the infirmary, was not happy. Why is it that you always seem to show up with something dreadfully wrong with you? She asked in irritation while using a diagnosis spell on him. She frowned, however, as she got back the results. I don't know what you've been doing, but your body is on the verge of collapse, damaged nerves, burst vessels, and to top it off you have a crack on your magical core. Thankfully your core is larger and sturdier than most your age, so you aren't at risk to become a squib, she said seriously. Magical core? What's that? Nick asked weakly, since that sounded like something really important. Contrary to what most wizards would like to believe, we are actually very similar to magical beast in that we have a series of pathways in our bodies that allow magic to flow through them. The location where all these pathways meet up is a spot we have named the magical core. It's different for each location but is always located within the torso, or in rare cases even the head, but that's 1 in a billion to happen, she said, indulging his curiosity. Is damaging the core bad? Nick asked, worried he might have ruined himself on accident. Damage to the core merely results in a temporary loss of a certain amount of magic via dissipation until it heals. If the core isn't large and strong enough to handle that loss, the wizard is rendered a squib from the degradation of the magical pathways from atrophy. You are going to be fine so long as you rest and keep the stress on your core to a minimum for at least a month, she said, and Nick could only hopelessly agree to take it easy for an entire month. Chapter 265, The Details. Nick kept his condition from his friends since he didn't want them to worry for no reason. The entire school was in uproar the next day, however, since Aurors had come to the school the previous night and arrested Lockhart. Despite the Daily Prophet's headline being about Nick and the interview, he had very few people in the school cared, but not all. Look, Nick, you're on the front page. Ron pointed at the picture of Nick with Dumbledore, Fudge and Skeeter that was clearly taken when none of them were paying attention. Judging from how Colin Creevey was beaming at the photo, it was pretty clear where it came from. It was merely the first of many times. Nick joked with a grin, earning smiles from those around despite the many rolled eyes. Reckon they'll put the arrest on the front page tomorrow. It's what I'd do after all. Ron said offhandedly, and everyone in the know cringed at his insensitivity. Nick shook his head at that, though. I'm not some fragile snowflake that can't take a reminder even if it wasn't intended. Ron is right though about it being the headline for tomorrow. It's just far too rich to miss out on for the Prophet, he said with a smile. Prophet's been working hard to distract people about Grindelwald's actions of late to keep down the panic, but it's been an uphill battle from what I know. Seamus cut into the conversation from nearby at the long table. How do you know that? Hermione asked, confused and doubtful. My best mate Dean here wants to be a reporter after Hogwarts and has been talking to the folk at the Prophet to get some references after he graduates. They let it slip in one of the letters, Seamus said while grabbing Dean Thomas to show him off. Straight from the horse's mouth, hey? Yup, that'll definitely count as good proof, Nick said with a nod. I find it a bit strange that the man hasn't been caught yet. Whole town sacrificed for some unknown reason and the person responsible leaves no trace of his whereabouts. Suspicious to say the least, Hermione said, and Nick shook his head again. There's nothing strange about it at all, really. The man is not only an extremely powerful wizard, but he is also a natural seer. He can simply see any potential ambushes ahead of time and avoid them, he said, and Hermione went quiet. If that's true, how'd he get caught last time? Harry asked, confused. Last time he realized that Dumbledore was the final obstacle in his way and purposefully allowed himself to be caught in a duel to decide the fate of the wizarding world. He lost that duel and was captured, Nick said honestly, since this was all public information. So all we have to do is wait for Dumbledore to duel him again and win again, Ron said with a relieved expression. It's not that simple this time, I'm afraid. Last time both of them duelled, they were roughly equal in terms of both health and power. This time, however, Grindelwald has made himself younger while Dumbledore is still an old man. The only real advantage Dumbledore has now is that he has had all this time to improve his power and skill even further from that time, while Grindelwald has stagnated to a degree in the last 50 years. It's tough to say who would win if they truly fought again, Nick said seriously, and everyone who heard him looked horrified. He didn't mention that Dumbledore also had the Elder Wand as well, since that wasn't the sort of information you hand out carelessly. Most didn't even know the Deathly Hallows were real, much less that two of them were in this school at the exact same moment. Nick hadn't thought all that much about the Hallows, to be honest, since they clearly operated on a set of rules that he didn't quite understand. Stressing himself to try and figure out those rules was simply not worth the effort on his part. Sure, the things were powerful, but he was pretty sure they were also cursed with misfortune. Every previous wielder of the wand had met an ill fate without exception, and each person who used the stone knowingly tended to go insane. The only real exception to this was the cloak, but Nick had a sneaking suspicion that that was only because it had been passed down in the Peverell bloodline all this time and had no reason to curse its users. This also explained why Harry lived a full and good life after Voldemort's defeat, despite having possessed all three before. As the last living descendant of the Peverell bloodline, Harry was immune to the curse on the Hallows. Chapter 266, Growing Allies. Everyone went to their classes after that, and the rest of the day was fairly normal for Nick. He did learn something interesting, however, that honestly got him a little excited. Apparently, while the position was vacant for the time being, Dumbledore himself had taken up teaching the subject of Dada. This was a wonderful thing in Nick's opinion, since despite his character flaws, the old goat definitely knew how to teach. He had been one of the previous Dada teachers before Armando Dippet stepped down from his position as headmaster and handed to roll over to him. The old goat was also the previous professor of Transfiguration before he gave that position to McGonagall. The crazy thing is that the previous headmaster of the school is still alive today at the old age of 354. Regardless of anything else, Dumbledore knew his stuff when it came to teaching the subject. This meant that the education of the students would finally get a stabilized foundation. That was the thing about having a new teacher every year, the students' learning suffered as a result. For the older students, they were kinda out of luck in this regard, as they won't really get the benefit of a stable education. But for the younger students like Nick and his friends, it was a mighty fine opportunity. The best part was that Dumbledore apparently had a habit of sharing useful information not normally taught if the class showed the right motivation. For example, each and every student taught by the man when he was the Dada professor learned how to cast the Patronus charm. Granted, that was only for the 4th years and above, but the principle still stood. No student of the old man's was truly mediocre unless they chose that for themselves. Nick surprised his friends by hanging out with them in the workshop as he worked on enchanting with the Daedric runes, since he was supposed to be relaxing. It should come as no small surprise that the Daedric runes were exceptional at manipulating space, souls, fire, flesh, and life force considering their origins. They were so good at it in fact that Nick had to actively make sure not to include any symbols related to those subjects, or the enchantment warped to include them in strange ways. For example, when he tried to enchant a ring to create water and accidentally created a blood fountain, it was very messy. He had also offered to tutor his friends in creation, but was surprised to learn that out of all of them only Ron had any talent with veritology. To be specific, he was almost prodigious with wood and easily soaked up the knowledge Nick had on the subject. He was a bit clumsy at first using the tools Nick had to shape wood, but he rapidly improved. Hermione and Daphne both showed great promise with runes on the other hand, and with his knowledge of exact translation were quickly picking up the subject. Harry had no talent at all with any form of crafting, which was fine by him since he was really good at charms, flying, and Dada type stuff. Tracy surprisingly was actually fairly talented at metalwork instead. As Nick's most advanced field of knowledge, he easily guided her in the proper way to work each type of metal, as well as a good diet and exercise plan to really pick up the skill. Luna was the odd woman out in this way, however, as she refused to learn any of the things he was willing to teach. Flitwick had apparently heard the commotion of all of this work going on and checked in to see what was happening. My word! I simply cannot express my joy to see so many of my students showing an interest in craftsmanship. The small man said with so much happiness he actually cried a little. I noticed that I was starting to distance myself from my friends and figured I may as well see if any of them could learn from me in any way, besides my own person crafting method of course. Nick said honestly. He meant it too, since at this point Voldemort was a non-threat and will be taken care of soon enough. Compared to the bullshit he had to deal with in the future, the Dark Lord was the least of his concerns. Nick had also realized that he needed powerful allies at his side to deal with the future, and who better than his friends to take that job. I am glad you have seen the truth of this matter, Nick. I could have told you myself, but you needed to figure it out yourself to grow as a person. Flitwick said with a wide smile. Chapter 267, Throwing Flamel Under the Bus. Not going to lie, that sounded cringy as hell. Nick said with a chuckle, and Flitwick laughed. I suppose it did, but that's just the way of things, I suppose. The small man said sagely. Nick's group all just rolled their eyes at this and went back to what they were doing. Nick on the other hand chose to start up a genuine conversation with the professor. That reminds me, for whatever reason, but whatever happened to that idea of yours to get some crafting classes set up? He asked while conjuring up a few chairs for them to sit down on. Flitwick sat down on the short chair Nick had conjured for him and sighed. Hogwarts simply doesn't have the funds to hire the teachers nor supply the materials needed for practice, so the idea fell flat the moment I presented it to Albus, unfortunately. The half-goblin said with a disappointed expression. Nick frowned. Is Hogwarts's finances really that bad? Don't get me wrong, I very much understand that it is costly to fund novices learning craftsmanship, but Hogwarts is the school of witchcraft and wizardry. The school should have more funding than it knows what to do with at this point. Nick said in disbelief. I wholeheartedly agree with you, but sadly the truth is that the school's finances are truly that bad. The decades-long curse on the Dada position has forced Albus to spend more and more money hiring a new teacher each year, and it has unfortunately added up to this wretched state we find ourselves in. The Charms Master said honestly. Nick smiled. So if that curse were gone and a large fortune were to be injected into the school, those classes would become possible, correct? He asked with a glint in his eyes. Flitwick was taken back by this question, but knew better than to dismiss it as a thing of curiosity. In theory that is correct, yes. Why? He asked curiously. Because just yesterday I helped the headmaster remove that curse, so all that is left would be the funds, and I know just how to get them. Nick said with a wide grin. This statement left everyone in the room who was listening to the conversation speechless. Truly? Flitwick asked in disbelief. Nick scoffed. Why would I lie about such a thing? You can ask either Dumbledore and Snape about it as they were both there for the matter, and so long as you mention I told you about it they should verify the matter for you," he said honestly. Flitwick wasted no time at all and excitedly left the room after that, likely to do exactly as Nick suggested. "How do you plan to get the funding though?" Daphne asked curiously, since as a pure-blooded heir to an ancient family she was well aware that it wasn't so easy to convince wizarding families to part with wealth if it doesn't directly benefit themselves. It certainly didn't help that Dumbledore could not ask for money from them himself, since many of these same families really didn't like him and some even hated him. "That's the beauty of it, I won't need to lift a single finger after sending one letter," Nick said proudly, leaving her confused. "To who?" Ron asked, also curious about this. "Nicholas Flamel," Nick said with a wide grin, and all of his friends realized exactly how this could work. They remembered the information on Nicholas Flamel vividly after the fiasco from last year, so they knew that the man may as well treat gold like dirt since he could easily make more. It would be a simple matter to the great alchemist to secretly give a small fortune to the school without anyone knowing. But Dumbledore said that Nicholas Flamel and his wife will die before the start of this year after the stone was destroyed. Harry said, confused. Nick laughed at this, which confused everyone until he eventually stopped and explained himself. "I don't know what's funnier, that you think something as powerful as the Philosopher's Stone could be so easily destroyed, or that that man would actually die in such a manner," he said with a smile. "The Philosopher's Stone can transmute materials flawlessly and even extend one's lifespan near indefinitely. And that's just the stuff that is publicly known about. Something like that can be many things, but fragile is certainly not one of them. What you broke last year was undoubtedly a fake used as bait to draw out Voldemort. So obviously the actual stone's creator is merely using his favorite trick and playing dead. He has already done something similar 7 times already, including this one," Nick said, leaving his friends dumbfounded. Chapter 268, Old Alchemist. Nicholas Flamel POV. Things had been quiet for the last few months after I faked my wife Pernell and I's deaths once again. It never ceased to amaze me how easily the vast majority of people accepted our deaths despite our record of faking it. I had contemplated actually dying several times over my long life, but honestly speaking I couldn't accept leaving with so much left that I didn't understand. I was one of the few people aware of the being called death after having seen it personally. Yes, I had met death before, and what I learned from it confused me. Despite its Dementor-esque visage, it couldn't be further from the foul creatures in what it was. The death that visited me so long ago was nothing more than the spiritual projection of some other being made manifest. I didn't know this at the time, of course, since I hadn't yet reached the astral realm in alchemy yet, and as such was quite unfamiliar with spiritual magics. The astral realm was a strange place that didn't exist in the physical plane exactly, but rather sat just outside it. Curiously though, it could only be accessed via crafting skill for some reason. While it was possible to physically enter the astral realm with one's body, it was very stressful as the place was highly spiritual in nature and as such rejected living things. It was the very same spiritual nature that had allowed me to gain enough understanding of souls to identify the false nature of death. It was frighteningly powerful for starters, and old, so very old it was like all of history rested upon its shoulders. And that was just what I observed of the mere projection sent by that being, which was chilling to say the least. I had looked for whoever it was that accessed the astral realm last year, but had failed to discover any trace of them this entire time. In the end I simply chalked it up to some accidental occurrence on a random craftsman's part and stopped looking. Albus was still searching for the fellow though, since he hoped to ally with them, since they were apparently within England somewhere. The fake stone destroyed in that school last year was merely a magical energy storage gem that I had made to imitate the real thing on Albus's behalf. I was also not very concerned about that misguided man running around causing trouble all over the place either. Truthfully speaking, the only reason I had even gotten involved in the previous conflict with him was that he threatened my home in Paris. While it was regrettable that he was taking so many lives, I had seen a single Muggle war take multiple times more before many times in my long life, and as such ignored it. That said, I did investigate the reason for why he even needed so many sacrifices and was quite shocked at what I learned. Unlike Albus and most others who weren't skilled enough to recreate the temporal remnant of an event, I was. Once I replayed the event of the sacrifice, I discovered that in fact each town sacrificed was nothing more than fuel for a grand array ritual all over the globe. The goal of that ritual was none other than to increase the ambient magic levels globally to an unheard of level that had even my heart beating in excitement. It was a clever loophole in the agreement he had made over 50 years ago, as his plan had nothing to do with Muggles in truth but was using them purely as a means to his end goal. I could easily predict how the world would change following this grand ritual being completed, and had to applaud how he accomplished his previous goal indirectly using this method. Magical energy interferes with more complex forms of technology than simple machines, and as such all the weapons capable of truly threatening wizarding society such as those atomic bombs will cease to function entirely. In fact, the Muggles' very way of life would get forcefully sent back to nearly 6 centuries or so technology-wise. I had no reason to stop this change either, as both Pernell and I had long since found the way to elevate our power to the next level but couldn't take that step due to insufficient magical energy. Simply being so close to taking that step had left our bodies weak and frail as we struggled to sustain ourselves, much less grow stronger. Today was especially interesting for me, however, as curiously enough I received a letter. It was a simple thing really, with no hidden enchantments or even fancy packaging. The fascinating part, however, was that it was delivered by the phoenix that accompanied Albus most of the time and yet wasn't from him. Chapter 269, Old Alchemist, 2. Flammel POV. The name of the sender was one I knew but wasn't personally acquainted with, despite how amusing the owner of it seemed to be. Albus had of course told me of the student that was giving him the most stress since he popped up out of nowhere, Nicholas Ravenclaw. A monstrous genius in almost every regard that seemed to be involved in several important affairs both secretly or directly. I was quite interested in meeting this young man after hearing about his self-created enchanting method and rapidly growing skill in crafting. Interestingly enough, the young man seems to have chosen the hardest but most beneficial form of growth, in that he did not choose to learn in a specialized manner but in every regard. Veridology, charms, metallurgy, enchanting, and most recently even spent a few days learning from the merfolk in the Black Lake. From what Albus said in his letters, the lad was insatiable in his pursuit of knowledge, no matter how obscure. I couldn't help but feel a bit happy when Albus had told me of the lad's great proclivity for illusion magics. It was an underutilized branch of the arcane and as such had been stagnant for quite some time. I had very little doubt that the young lad would eventually dip his toes into alchemy as well, since he clearly had a talent for the stuff, like most gifted in transfiguration. Opening the simple parchment letter with a smile, I read the contents held within it. Once I was done, I set the letter down and stroked my chin in thought over what it said. It seems this lad has seen through my little death act easily. Surprisingly, the lad has even asked for my aid in favor of the school in his first letter. On one hand, his request was indeed easy to accommodate for myself, while on the other I know how loath Albus is to ask my aid in this matter. Perhaps it is for the best that I follow the lad's idea and donate a small sum of wealth into the school via a proxy so that I still remain anonymous. I do wonder what sort of face Albus will make after getting this small fortune. Ah! Perhaps I should take a trip to the English Isle to visit this young man myself. POV end. Obviously Nick had in fact written up a letter and had it sent to the Grand Alchemist by the only creature on the planet that could track him down. See, the man was very clever and made it impossible to send him letters via owl, as the birds instead went straight to a drop-off location that he checked for mail regularly. He had stopped, however, in order to play the part of dead man semi-convincingly. This meant that one needed to either personally track the man down or get the services of Fawkes to get a hold of the alchemist in hiding. The first option was hopeless, considering the man had over 600 years of experience and power under his belt, so trying to forcefully find him was a fool's errand. For most people, getting Fawkes's help delivering a letter was right on the same level of difficulty with how prideful he was. Nick, however, was a very different matter, since he was the lord of all birds, including phoenixes. All he needed to do was ask, and Fawkes happily took the letter to the alchemist under Dumbledore's speechless gaze. Nick hadn't asked or anything to use the phoenix, but walked into the office and handed over the letter nonchalantly. I admit you have me rather envious of your gift with birds. Did you know it took me no less than 10 years to get him to agree to deliver letters for me? The old man asked with a sigh. Nick shrugged. I didn't expect to get this wand either, but since I did, I see no reason why I shouldn't use the gifts it's given me. He said casually. It is certainly a useful ability to have, if nothing else. Lemon drop? The headmaster offered. Don't mind if I do, Nick said while grabbing one of the yellow candies from the bowl. Dumbledore chuckled. You may be surprised to learn that few actually accept that offer, he said with a small smile. Understandable really, but as a student I have guessed right while here, you could not offer me poisoned food any more than you could attack me, so I have nothing to fear, Nick said with a shrug. So few even seem to understand that, sadly, though I am curious how you are familiar with guest right. The old man asked, interested. Nick shrugged. Helena thought I should be familiar with magical etiquette, he said honestly. Chapter 270, Training. Nick left the headmaster shortly after that and spent the rest of the day slowly teaching his friends what he could. While most were slowly familiarizing themselves with crafting, Harry and Luna were exposed to the terror that was Nick in duels. He might not agree with most of the man's ideas, but the dueling club Lockhart would have eventually created was an excellent one. Since neither of them will learn a craft, then I may as well train them up to fight. That was his thought on the matter. Neither of the two got any mercy from him either, as he regularly destroyed them in the duels. They were fast learners however, so they improved rapidly under the pressure he exerted on them. Expelliarmus. Stupefy. Harry and Luna cast spells at the same time in the area Nick set aside in the workshop to hold these mock fights. Nick saw the two spells and casually flicked his wand Protego. Fumos. He spoke firmly and a thick circular barrier blocked the two spells before vanishing as a cloud of black smoke filled the area they were standing in. While their vision was obscured, he moved quickly, tapping his wand against the ground. The floor rose and fell like water. Eep. Luna called out as she clearly fell over from the unbalanced moving floor. Nick locked onto her location based on that sound in Vorto. He said, and the spell shot through the smoke and struck Luna as she was trying to get up. She stopped trying immediately as her perception of gravity was flipped, and Harry sent a stunner at Nick through the smoke that Nick caught with his wand tip and returned at double the strength. Match. He called out and cleared away the smoke. Harry was knocked out on the floor and Luna was hugging the ground like she was afraid to fall to the ceiling. Finite. Re-enervate. Nick said, waking Harry up and returning Luna's perception to normal. Bloody hell, Nick, do you always have to be so rough? Harry complained and Luna nodded in agreement. You'll thank me for it later. Nick said with a chuckle. And what about the shield charm? Why haven't you taught us that yet? Luna asked, clearly upset at his showing said spell off. Because you don't have enough magic to use it in a duel, even if you somehow pulled it off you would be drained afterwards. Nick said with a smile, ruffling her hair since he knew she hated that. She hissed at him while swatting away his hand much like a cat would, much to his amusement. You can use it though, Harry pointed out with a small smile at Luna's antics. I also have more magic than both of you combined, so my point still stands. Nick said before going to check on Hermione and Daphne's progress with runes. This is too long and this is too short and this is the letter A instead of E like it should be. He pointed out the flaws in Hermione's work before frowning at Daphne's. What did I say about sentence chains? They are vertical instead of horizontal. By flipping them you need to adjust the angles slightly. Also this, and this are all wrong. He scolded and then proceeded to show her the correct way to write the same sentence. He moved on to Ron after that, who was still stuck on identifying the magical from non-magical varieties of wood. Remember that magical woods tend to look more vibrant than non-magical ones. He said helpfully. Tracy didn't have any issues at the moment, so Nick didn't bother her as she worked to memorize the various metallurgic facts he had given her. There was no point in her touching a single tool if she couldn't tell the difference between a sewage block and hardy tool. Conjuring up and chair, Nick went back to carving Daedric runes to continue to familiarize himself with them. He didn't run any magic through the runic chains in his trial objects until he was in the designated testing area after the whole blood fountain incident. He finally completed his attempt at creating a water conjuring ring after the 8th try, since the previous 7 tries didn't go so great. Still, he got points from the system for them as well as when he traded them in for more points. None of them were higher than uncommon rank-wise, but points were points, so he didn't complain. What sort of runes are you even working on anyways, since I have never seen anything like that before? Hermione asked curiously after catching a glimpse of the Daedric runes. Demonic runes is probably the closest answer I can give that you would understand. Nick said casually. Chapter 271, Passing Time. Why are you using those then? Hermione exclaimed in horror. The language itself is highly conductive for magic, and so long as I avoid certain phrases run no risk of bringing any member of said race here. In other words, it's perfectly safe so long as I'm careful. Nick said with a shrug. That's not what I mean. Isn't that dark magic? Hermione pressed worriedly. It's just a language, so it's not inherently evil, just like how Latin is used for many dark spells and yet isn't banned. There is nothing inherently evil about it, relax. Nick said reassuringly. Where would you even find something like demonic runes to begin with? Ron asked curiously. I got it over the summer from a bookshop with a surprisingly large variety of books to choose from. Nick said honestly while snickering to himself at the inside joke. Daphne frowned however when he said this, as she had been up and down Diagon Alley with her parents since she was little and had never seen a bookstore like that. Sure, most of the ones in the alley had a wide selection, but save a few obscure books most of them had the same things. What's it called? She asked, suspicious of what he said. It's a secret. After all, I don't want you sending your families to clear out all those rare and useful tomes should you find it. Nick said with a grin. Daphne didn't want to accept that answer, but she could tell that he was very serious about keeping his source secret. He may be grinning and joking around, but his body language showed how he tensed up when questioned about his source. Having such a strong body meant that his reactions were far more pronounced than normal. I think it would be better if you avoided those runes, or at the least had a professor present to make sure nothing strange happened, Hermione said, still very concerned about the jagged runes he was carving. Nick just waved off her concern though, since even if something miraculously went wrong, none of the professors would be able to handle it either. For example, if he somehow summoned a Dremora, they would pretty much all be fucked, since those things were legitimately immortal and stupid powerful. That reminds me, for whatever reason, but since Daedra reform in the waters of Oblivion, and if I killed one in this world, would they go back to Oblivion or somewhere else? He pondered seriously. Hermione still kept nagging at Nick for the next couple days about the Daedric runes, much to his irritation. It was already bad enough to him that he couldn't forge since he was still recovering and didn't want to risk further damage to himself. Madame Pomfrey's prediction that his energy level would be temporarily reduced was also proven true. Nick had found that his mana was only at the level of a fifth-year student during this time, which relieved him a bit since it forced him to limit himself to that level of spell work. Time passed by in a flash as he fell into the schedule, and his own teaching and training, and Halloween was today. Admittedly, he simply stopped making rapid progress in his self-improvement once he hit the core work for the fourth year, as it took a leap forward in complexity. He was still quite ahead of Hermione, that was almost halfway through the third year's syllabus, but the gap wasn't nearly as wide as he was used to. Surprisingly enough, during this time Luna actually succeeded in petting Dusk without Nick needing to save her. She had been slowly desensitizing the bird to her close proximity by giving him treats, typically in the form of bacon or sausage. Finally, in the second week of October, she accidentally touched him while giving him a treat. She then slowly started to accidentally touch him more and more until she finally got what she wanted and could freely stroke him on the chest. Dusk knew what she was doing, of course, but let his gluttony get the best of him. There was a nip in the air when Nick woke up today, and he bundled up a bit more than normal as a result. Fall had truly started to hit in full effect, as the plants around the castle were wilting and or dying. This was great news as far as he was concerned, since it included the plants in herbology that were lethargic and much easier to deal with for him. Nick had thought about making a ring to improve his ability to deal with the plants, but honestly had no idea where to start, since talent was not exactly something properly defined. Chapter 272, Not So Quiet Halloween. Without a basis by which to build the enchantment, he would only have the weakest possible enchantment, which was simply not worth it in his opinion. One would assume that Hagrid's gifted ring that made him closer to nature would count, but it simply did not work on plants. In fact, the ring simply made Hagrid ever so slightly more in tune with the wildlife nearby. As a result, Nick resigned himself to remain vigilant against the plants during herbology lessons. Leaving the dorm room at his normal time, Nick was surprised to see the twins up and about. They were dressed in tattered robes and had on realistic masks that made them look like zombies. The masks were clearly enchanted to fit snugly and move with one's facial expressions to truly give off the effect of a true undead. "Looking good, boys, I'm sure you'll scare up a storm," Nick said as he walked out into the common room. "You don't look very scared to me," Fred said with rotten teeth and a maggot crawling out of his cheek. Nick scoffed. "The glamour enchantment might work on most people, but I regularly use illusion spells, so it is barely acceptable in my opinion," he said honestly. "Oh yeah, we'd like to see you do better then," George challenged with a raised eyebrow. Nick grinned and drew his wand before pointing its tip at himself. "Lupi Viditur." He spoke and an illusion spell flowed over him, but from the fearful and amazed looks of the twins' rotten faces, the spell worked as intended. From the outside perspective, Nick's appearance was replaced with a huge, densely muscular silver-furred creature that looked like a perfect mix of man and wolf. Unlike actual werewolves that were pale, furless, malformed creatures, this appearance was much fiercer looking. This illusion spell had been created by a wizard a couple hundred years ago when he for whatever reason felt the need to terrorize a village that had mocked him. As a result, when Nick moved, the wolfen monster moved in the exact same way, with each contraction of its powerful muscles being visible. Nick slowly walked around the furniture of the common room while staring down the twins like a predator patiently stalking its prey. Smiling widely, Nick watched the nervous expressions of the twins as they watched him leisurely close the distance. He stopped in front of them and looked down a little, which had the wolf monster appear to be staring down at them from its high height. "Boo!" he said with a grin, and both of the twins gulped in fear. Satisfied, he raised his wand again and pointed it at himself. "Finite," he said, and the illusion faded away like fog in the summer sun. "Good enough?" he asked smugly. "Oi mate, you have got to teach us that spell. I've got goosebumps just thinking about it," Fred said excitedly. "Compared to that, these trinkets aren't worth a single nut." George agreed wholeheartedly with his twin. "No can do, I'm afraid. This is my trick to scare the bejesus out of everyone today." If I taught both of you it won't work. I've got one for a Dementor though if you're willing to do me a bit of a favor. Nick said with a mischievous smile. The twins recognized that look and smiled widely. What can we do for you, friend? They asked at the same time, and Nick leaned forward to tell them his plan. A few minutes later he walked out of the common room with a smirk while the twins were cackling to themselves. With a single part of his plan in place, Nick quickly moved through the hall towards Flitwick's office to set up another piece of the plan in advance. With no life-threatening or terrible villain in the background for this year after he had gotten rid of the diary, Nick wanted to still put on a grand performance as should be tradition at Hogwarts. This required the aid of several different people to pull off perfectly. Once Flitwick's assistance was acquired, Nick went straight to the next person who he needed assistance from. Soon enough the day passed by and it was dinner time in the castle and all the preparations had been made. Nick himself was currently sitting on his broom hidden under disillusionment alongside Fred and George on their own brooms within the enchanted sky of the Great Hall as students started to fill the hall. Dumbledore had already instructed most of the staff not to interfere no matter what happens tonight, so this performance will go down without a hitch. Once everyone was in attendance, Fred and George made their moves as they covered themselves and their brooms in the Dementor illusion while the Great Hall's temperature dropped. Chapter 273, Not So Quiet Halloween, 2. The disillusionment spell on them was dispelled slowly and they seemed to manifest in the Great Hall's sky out of nowhere, eliciting screams from several students as they slowly flew down and over the heads of the Fours Houses students while making haunting raspy breathing sounds that the real Dementors were known to have. Dumbledore stood up at this time and spoke. "Be not alarmed, as I shall deal with these creatures," he said dramatically, which caused Nick to roll his eyes as the old man pulls out his wand. "Expecto Patronum." The old man's voice boomed and from the tip of his wand a bright white light shot out towards the twins, solidifying into a phoenix along the way. "Hiss!" The twins hissed as if in pain as the patroness approached them and began to try and fly away from the corporeal spell chaotically. This resulted in a chase of light and dark in the air overhead, much to the students' awe. Eventually though, the twins saw the signal from Flitwick and flew towards the headmaster as if they were going to fight to the death with him. Flitwick then stood up and pointed at where Nick was flying overhead with his wand. "Lupus Dea," he spoke loudly while a bright flash of light appeared, which Nick used to appear in his wolfen illusion form. He then stored away his broom and started to fall towards the two twins under the stunned gazes of the entire student body. Nick's illusion self wrapped its claws around the two twins' throats, making it look as though he had captured the two of them, and roared loudly thanks to a voice-changing potion like a savage beast. "Ray-a-a-a-a-a-a." His voice filled the whole room, raising plenty of goosebumps in the process. Dumbledore then waves his wand and the patroness crashed into the twins, exploding in a burst of light while they hissed in pain. Nick opened his mouth wide and under the horrified gazes of the students had his illusion self bite down on the heads of both of the twins, who went limp before vanishing in a whirlpool-like manner when they were in fact simply just disillusioned again. Nick raised his head towards the sky and howled in triumph, "Oh!" And while that was happening, Gnaggle secretly cast a transfiguration on the ground that made it seem as though Nick's wolf illusion self was turning to stone as he howled. Nick then cancelled his illusion. That exact same moment Flitwick disillusioned him, allowing him to go unnoticed as he slipped away. The entire student body stood up and clapped in amazement and joy as Dumbledore wished everyone a happy Halloween. Nick and the twins had sneaked into the Gryffindor table during this standing ovation with wide smiles. Surprisingly, Dumbledore had went off script and decided to oust the actors of this little show as well as its mastermind to everyone here. As much as I would like to take credit for this wonderful entertainment, I am not the mind behind it. I would ask you all to applaud the true stars in this matter, our own Filius Flitwick, Severus Snape, Minerva McGonagall, and of course myself. In the roles of Dementor, Fred and George Weasley. Everyone in the room zeroed in the twins, who bowed with wide smiles as everyone clapped loudly. Finally, in the role of Guardian Wolf and the mind behind this entire event, Nicholas Ravenclaw. Dumbledore said loudly, and it was Nick's turn to bow and receive a standing ovation. After that, it was finally time for the feast that was just as grand as last year's Halloween dinner with various pumpkin dishes. "Why didn't you mention that you guys were doing this?" Ron asked Nick, slightly upset at not being included. "And ruin the surprise for everyone, never," Nick said, and the twins at either side of him nodded in agreement. "Besides, these two are natural actors and you have to admit played the role of Dementor perfectly," he added while patting the twins on the shoulder. "It was brilliant, mate," Harry said with a smile. "I still can't believe you managed to get Snape involved in this whole thing though," Seamus said from nearby in amazement. Nick shrugged. "It actually wasn't that hard really, I gave him a bit of a challenge while also properly paying for his time and effort. That voice-changing potion was something he had to come up with on the spot and only just finished before it was time to perform," he said honestly. "Bloody hell, I can't even seem to brew a potion from the book and he made one out of nowhere. Ron asked incredulous. Chapter 274, Math is Hard. Nick shook his head. Not exactly brand new since there are already several potions that can change one's voice. What he had to do instead was use the information from those potions to figure out how to create a potion with the effect you saw previously. Compared to actually making a totally new potion, this is many times easier to do. He explained honestly. It's still really impressive either way, he added seriously. Nick spent the rest of dinner chatting with his housemates about the show he had put on. Without the diary around to open the chamber and sick the basilisk on a cat, of all things October ended nice and quietly, minus the monthly sacrifice of course. Nick felt it however when his core finally recovered, as he was suddenly filled with much more energy than he had gotten used to. As a bonus, he also made a breakthrough in his wand making runes thanks to him experimenting with Daedric runes in place of the normal ones. The meaning behind the runes was the same as the normal ones, but the effects were multiple times better. The reason for this was ironically the affinity Daedric runes had for souls and flesh. To put it simply, the use of Daedric runes instead of normal ones made the connection between wand and user much tighter than normal, which increased the efficiency of magic use by nearly 3 times as much as a normal wand. Ollivander would sell his left arm if it meant he could learn this information. Nick thought with a chuckle as he stored away the ebony and unicorn hair wand in greed. He had been reading up on space magic over the last month when he wasn't busy with his friends or normal school work. Unfortunately, that subject was extremely advanced and he had made absolutely zero progress in learning it. The reason for this was simply the fact that the stuff was heavily built upon arithmancy, which Helene refused to teach him for some reason. Oh, he had definitely asked several times, but she always avoided the subject somehow. The worst part in his opinion was that she never explained why she didn't want to teach him the subject. Left with little option, he was forced to try and figure it out himself via the books in the library. This was honestly speaking horribly inefficient for him, as all the books recorded was the rules and a few equations for various deductions. Normally this would be enough for, say, spell crafting and general easy predictions like who will sit where. The trouble came in the form of permutation and additional variables in the situation that each had their own rules and equations. Arithmancy could in theory predict literally everything that could happen or will eventually happen if one took every possible conclusion and variable into account. This was what it meant to be omniscient, in fact, to know all things at all times. Unfortunately, reaching such a state was impossible for limited minds such as Nick's. The closest a limited mind could get was the ability to divine the future. That was actually what set seers apart from advanced arithmancers. Seers peered directly at the results of an impossibly large number of events happening simultaneously. Arithmancers instead deduce the step-by-step process of reaching an outcome, which was in fact way harder. Obviously Nick wasn't trying to reach that point, since there was honestly no point in doing so for him. Despite this, it was still stupidly hard to get the hang of even simple arithmetic predictions. Today was a Saturday however, and Nick had plans that involved killing a very large and very old snake. He had prepared for this by transfiguring 5 of Hagrid's roosters into marbles that he kept in his pocket. He had also brought Dusk along to the second-floor girls' bathroom as a distraction for the basilisk, since the bird was immune to the instant kill effect of its eyes. The bathroom was fairly well maintained despite the fact it was unused due to the last victim of the basilisk, Moaning Myrtle. She was a 14-year-old when she was killed for discovering the Chamber of Secrets and had twin-tailed brown hair, bad acne and glasses. This appearance had remained after her death until today, as she haunted the bathroom where she was killed. She very rarely left the bathroom, which was what made the events of the second year originally improbable. Since she rarely left the bathroom and couldn't be killed again since she was a ghost, so she would definitely have known about the possessed Ginny opening the chamber the entire year. Getting revenge on the person who killed her would definitely be something she would do with her spiteful personality. Chapter 275, Chamber of Secrets. Myrtle's bathroom was rather primitive, all things considered, as the toilets and sinks were very primitive in functionality. The sinks were obviously an original part of the castle, since they were basically magical water basins like those in his own manor on Ravenclaw Island. The toilets however were definitely added on later, since the founders' time didn't have them. Nick wasn't here for an architecture tour though, and ignored most of the bathroom. "Come to mock poor helpless little Myrtle, have you?" A feminine voice spoke up mockingly from nearby. Nick turned to look at the source of this sound and wasn't surprised to see the ghost haunting this bathroom acting like she was sitting on the stall walls. "Not at all, Myrtle, I am merely here to use a secret passage hidden in this room," Nick said with a smile. Clearly his reaction to her sudden appearance caught her off guard, as she went silent for a bit before snorting and leaving with a silver blush on her ghostly face. People like Myrtle were easy to deal with thanks to their almost paranoid levels of self-depreciation that made them very uncomfortable when spoken to kindly or with respect. It's sad that merely acting like a decent person was enough to make such people flee, but Nick couldn't do anything to fix that, so he ignored it. Finally alone, Nick slipped on his parcel tongue ring and walked over to the circular sinks. Open! He spoke with authority, and the sinks magically started to move in order to reveal a wide long pipe that he couldn't see the bottom of. Removing the parcel tongue ring, Nick points at his feet with his chest. Uranium pedes. He speaks and a blue streak hits his chest. Carefully placing his foot flat on the vertical surface of the pipe, he takes a deep breath and leans into the foot. Normally he would immediately start falling if he did this, but thanks to the spider walking charm he now stood on a vertical surface like gravity was not a factor. He was slightly nervous taking that first step, but since the spell was working as per usual, he smiled and started to jog down the pipe. Thanks to his strong body and incredible stamina, he had no problem at all jogging for the entire hour it took for him to finally reach the chamber's true entrance. There were bones of various kinds all over the ground, as well as a large amount of white powder that he recognized as bone dust. On top of all of that was a huge green snakeskin that shone faintly in his magical senses. Nick walked over to the skin and ran his hands along its scales that were smooth and sharp like push daggers. Unlike most snakes that didn't actually shed their hides, the basilisk was clearly different, as this snakeskin was no different from natural leather. It still held some of the natural magic of the beast as well, making it very valuable for crafting. Nick folded the 80-foot-long shed up by tapping it with his wand before storing it away in greed after transfiguring it into a small block of wood. He didn't have enough room in greed to keep it full-sized after all. Once that was collected, he walked forward, ignoring the crunching of bones underfoot as he found the large metal door with various snakes carved on it alongside incredibly enough parcel tongue runes. They looked like a bunch of squiggles meant for decoration but were in fact an actual written language. The words written on the metal door spelled out, "Here stands the chamber of the great Salazar Slytherin, greatest of the Hogwarts Four." Nick snorted at this egotistical sentence. More like most notorious of the four, he thought before putting the parcel tongue ring back on and commanding the door to open. The metal serpents retracted their heads one by one before the metal door swung open on its own. Well, at the very least the man knew how to make his enchantments last, if nothing else, he admitted as he stepped into the true Chamber of Secrets. It was cold and dirty, but plenty of signs of its previous glory remained, as there were serpent statues lining the walls and burning green Gubrathian flames cast light through the entire massive room. There was a stone walkway leading to a deep pool of water that sat under a massive stone face that was obviously Slytherin himself. On either side of the walkway were deep pits filled with water as well. Other than this, however, the room was fairly empty, as there was nothing else within sight. Nick acted like he didn't notice the massive magical creature starting to move behind the statue's face as he walked into the chamber. Chapter 276, Basilisk Dead. Tap tap tap. Nick's footsteps echoed throughout the chamber as he walked along the path towards the statue at its end. Once he reached the edge of the pool of water, he tapped his wand on its surface lightly. Immediately the water began to transform into ice as he transfigured a huge volume of water all at once, draining a decent chunk of his mana in the process. Large-scale transfigurations like this always took a huge amount of skill and power to accomplish, but Nick succeeded in basically sealing the chamber in thick ice so the basilisk can't flee into the water. Once that was done, Nick took out several marbles before looking straight at the face of the statue that had ominous and murderous ramblings coming from behind it as the basilisk waited impatiently for him to release it. "Speak to me, Slytherin." He spoke in a long string of hisses and the mouth of the statue began to open. Immediately Nick retreated backwards and conjured a massive amount of smoke to obstruct his vision of the basilisk with the Fumos spell. This was proven wise as the beast slithered out of the statue's mouth head first before loudly and angrily hissing when it noticed that he wasn't the master of it. Dusk flew off of Nick's shoulder and through the smoke before beginning its part of the plan and distracting the giant snake. Nick tapped on the ground and the stone rippled and transformed into chains that rapidly wrapped around the body of the King of Serpents. He was using his magical senses to accomplish this since his vision was impaired. A 1,000-year-old basilisk shone much brighter in them than even Dumbledore did, so he could easily tell nearly every detail of its body without seeing it. Its body was of course that of a giant snake, but there was a big difference in its head in the form of long antler-like horns with sharp points. This was what gave the basilisk its name as the King of Serpents, its crown. Nick's transfigured chains worked a charm to bind the giant snake as it tried to struggle against them angrily, but he had transfigured the metal to be adamantium, so it was a pointless effort. Once he was confident that it was well and truly bound, he smashed the marbles containing the roosters on the ground, turning them back into their bird state. Immediately they all began to crow at the same time, which caused the chamber to get very loud with the sound. The basilisk screamed in pain and violently thrashed about in an attempt to flee the crowing of the roosters, but failed to free itself. It did succeed in breaking a couple of links of the chains though, which was more than enough to show its crazy strength before it eventually fell over dead with blood streaming out from between its scales and eyes. The smell such blood had filled the entire chamber, making Nick grimace. Still he ignored the roosters that were constantly screaming and quickly transfigured a cloth over the basilisk's head to make sure it didn't accidentally kill him with whatever power remained in its eyes. He then cleared away the smoke, allowing him to truly see the beast fully. It had vibrant emerald green scales and a length of nearly 90 feet with a diameter nearly identical to that of a wine barrel at 7 feet across. The head was still covered with the cloth, but the sharp horns and almost draconic features under the cloth were visible thanks to how form-fitting it was. Mana was slowly leaving the body, proving it was truly dead, but Nick thought it a waste to let the monster's soul dissipate and pulled out the Nazgul ring and threw it at the corpse. Until all the magic in the body left, the soul will remain in the body, which is how ghosts can be formed, since the magic in their bodies can force them into that state before it dissipates. The ring landed on one of the horns and began to glow as it ate the soul of the beast. Something was different this time, however, as the glow of the ring wasn't pure white and gold like it was after eating a Horcrux, but rather had an emerald tint to it. Nick frowned at this, but he could feel from the wavelength of the ring that the ring considered it good for him. Nick hesitated slightly but steeled his resolve to take the risk after remembering the threat of Zeus that could come after him at any time. He made sure to be clear that he only wanted the green energy at the moment before he picked up the ring from the corpse. Chapter 277, Spoils. The Nazgul ring kept back the huge amount of energy from the basilisk's soul but injected the green energy into Nick by itself the moment he touched it. He stiffened while preparing to reject the energy or deal with extreme pain, but it sank into his soul seamlessly. Nothing happened at all and it confused Nick greatly. Channeling his spiritual energy, he saw that his soul was completely the same except a small bit of emerald green in it. That small amount of emerald didn't seem to do anything at all, so he chose to ignore it for now. Storing away the Nazgul ring that was currently like a sun in his magical senses, in greed he turned his attention back to the massive and extremely valuable corpse in front of him. Lifting the cloth up slightly, Nick tapped the first eye of the body, transfiguring it into a marble that he removed from the bloody socket. Ignoring the blood on his hand, he walks to the opposite side and repeats this process, at which time he banishes the cloth since the eyes were taken care of. Nick spent a moment to marvel at how amazing the beast was in its full glory before prying its mouth open with magic. Once open, Nick pulled out 2 large enchanted crystal flasks from greed and carefully placed them under the venomous long fang's sharp tips. He secured them in place with the sticking charm before pressing his bloody hand against the roof of the mouth and pushing. Immediately yellow-green liquid started to pour out of the fangs in large amounts, filling the flasks. Normal crystal flasks would have already dissolved under the venom of a basilisk, but these had been specially enchanted to be immune to the corrosion. Once the 2 head-sized flasks were nearly full, Nick unstuck them and corked them with enchanted crystal corks before storing them away. That was all of the venom of the basilisk, which was stupid expensive per drop normally. Nick then carefully extracted the fangs that he put in greed as well before closing the mouth of the corpse. He had a bit of a dilemma at that point, as there was honestly not a single part of the basilisk that wasn't a treasure, but he simply couldn't take everything at this moment as greed's space was simply not big enough. Dottie! He called out, and with a loud pop, the house elf appeared in the chamber. Dottie screamed in surprise and terror at the massive dead snake covered in blood nearby once the surroundings were taken in. Nick honestly didn't blame the house elf, since even a dead basilisk like this one was a terrifying thing indeed. I need you to take the body back to the manor and put it in stasis until I ask for it, Nick said seriously, and Dottie looked reluctant to touch the body but did as commanded. If the beast was still alive, this would be impossible for a single house elf like Dottie, but with the beast dead it wasn't an issue. Dismissing the chains that held the body down, Nick tapped the blood puddle with his wand, which caused it to all gather up and condense into a large red orb that he stored away in greed. Not missing a step, he walked over to the still open mouth of the statue and into it. His ability to see in the dark came in handy in this regard, as he could still see the path forward. Mission conditions established. Description: you have defeated the dreadful monster of the Chamber of Secrets and to the victor the spoils. Objectives: explore the chamber fully, claim the treasures within, optional, hidden, optional. Rewards: 2x item ticket, 1000 XRP, optional, 1x material ticket, optional. Status: incomplete. This new mission popped up in front of Nick, and after reading through it he frowned, since he really didn't like that one of the objectives was hidden. The reward for it was easily more valuable than any other the others, which meant that it was also likely much harder to accomplish. I'll try my best but not going to stress over it, he decided as he followed the dirty path. Soon enough he came across a large room filled with bones and long decayed snake skin. This was definitely the nest of the basilisk, but there must be something else here or the mission wouldn't say it, he thought seriously. Looking around the large room carefully, Nick finally found the hint he needed in the form of a very small snake statue in the corner. It had an arched back that made it obvious that it was a handle of some sort. Chapter 278, The Treasure in the Chamber. Nick gripped the handle and pulled, but nothing happened, so he instead tried to twist it left or right, and that did something. Piesch. The sound of pressurized air getting released came out and Nick retreated cautiously. Click. A loud click echoed through the room before a small hatch popped up out of the ground with the handle on its top. Nick carefully pulled the hatch open and was surprised to see that it was a stairway leading deeper underground. Cautiously he started down the stairs while leaving the hatch open behind him. He squinted when a torch suddenly lit up at the bottom of the stairs, revealing a small collection of books, artifacts, and materials. Clearly this was a sort of vault that Slytherin had used to hoard away his valuables. So I get a new visitor out of the blue, judging from the commotion above. You are no descendant of mine. A rough old voice said, and Nick froze. Turning to look at the source of the voice, Nick was surprised to see a portrait with a very lifelike visage of Slytherin in it that was calmly examining him. I wasn't expecting to find a living portrait of you here of all things. Nick admitted honestly. Salazar's portrait raised an eyebrow in surprise. Oh ho? Parcel-tongued it would seem, no wonder you could get into the chamber. The portrait said with a look of understanding. Nick hurriedly removed the parcel-tongue ring on his finger that he had forgotten about. He would have noticed sooner had it not been for the fact that as something magically bound to his bloodline, Dottie had access to some of its abilities, which included his all-speak. As a result, the house elf thought he was speaking English when in fact it was parcel-tongue. Sorry about that, I don't have very good control over that ability at the moment. Nick said awkwardly. It's fine since it took me nearly a decade to fully master it myself. I envy you to have a tool to make the process easier. The portrait said with a sigh. It should probably go without saying considering where you are, but I am Salazar Slytherin, Archmage, and Healer. The portrait then said proudly. Nicholas Ravenclaw, student and crafter. Nick returned the introduction. Ha! Rowena would be rolling in her grave if she knew that a descendant of hers was a parcel-tongue. The portrait laughed and spoke mockingly. Nick didn't feel like correcting the man and explaining that he actually spoke all languages. Still, it's a bit troublesome for one of her descendants to reach this room when my own failed to find it 50 years ago. I couldn't by chance convince you to leave this place empty-handed, could I? The portrait asked hopefully. Hang on, Voldemort failed to find this room 50 years ago. Nick asked, surprised to learn it. Yeah, the brat took one look at the room above and decided that it was merely Herma's nest alone. The portrait said with a disappointed expression. Nick found it rather funny that Voldemort missed out on all this treasure just because the room above was a huge mess. I suppose you plan to take everything in here, hey? The portrait asked calmly. If it makes you feel better, I can leave a copy of the books. Nick offered. How's about a trade instead? One question for you to leave one thing of my choosing behind. The portrait counter-offered. Nick shook his head. Why would I do that when your bloodline is all but extinct in the Isle? He asked seriously. The portrait frowned. What do you mean? It asked, not believing Nick at all. There was originally 3 members with your bloodline alive 70 years ago, but after the only daughter of the family, Marapi, died in childbirth to a Muggle's child, there was only 3 again. That child grew up and killed off the other descendants of yours, becoming the only one. And soon enough he too will die without an heir, thus ending your direct line. Nick explained calmly. The portrait looked distraught. Is there no way to save the last member of my bloodline until they can sire an heir? It asked sternly. Nick shook his head. He does not even have a body at the moment and is merely a spectre bound to the earth via Horcruxes. Those are being systematically destroyed, so he will soon be forcefully sent to the afterlife. He explained generously. Nick had no reason at all to lie to a mere portrait without any power to act on its own. That said, it didn't mean he was going to tell it that he was the one cutting away the last remnant of its likeness's bloodline. Chapter 279, Loot. Why would he create Horcruxes? Surely not to extend his lifespan, since he should only be about 60 or 70 at the moment. The portrait said with a frown. I can answer that question actually. His greatest fear is death. The idea that no matter how powerful he gets, all it takes is a single mistake for all of his effort to be rendered void terrifies him. So he split his soul into at the moment 6 Horcruxes that he hid away to try and be unkillable. Nick explained, and the portrait sighed. I can't exactly fault him for such a fear, as it is perfectly natural, but the way he accomplished it is simply dreadful. To use that old fool Herpo's flawed method to stave off death will only lead to madness. the portrait said with a look of disgust. Wait a moment, you said flawed method to describe the Horcruxes, which implies a perfect method existed. Nick pointed out with a very concerned look. How could he not be concerned when even Horcruxes were a pain in the ass to deal with and they were highly flawed? A perfected version of that same sort of magic would definitely be way harder to destroy. You've been sincere enough, so I suppose I can tell you about that subject. You see, after old Herpo lost his Horcrux and had his power crippled, he sought a way to recover and even perfect his creation in his madness, and he succeeded. Unfortunately, the perfect method required one to have a complete soul, and his was fractured and missing a part, which allowed us four to kill him and take his knowledge and treasures for ourselves. Rowena took a strange tree and a few books in ancient or unknown tongues. I took the staff of Asclepius and his research on basilisks. That fool Godric took the tomes of combat magic and magical swordsmanship. Helga, on the other hand, was more than happy to take all of his wealth instead. All of us agreed to destroy the perfected method he created, however, as it was beyond twisted and sacrilegious. Did you know that that madman thought that binding one's entire soul to an item and existing as a mere projected body was a good idea? Dreadful stuff even by my standards, and I am no saint, as you probably know. The portrait said seriously. Nick racked his brain when he heard the name Asclepius, as it sounded very familiar, and then he figured it out and was shocked. Asclepius was the god of medicine according to Greek mythology, and his staff was very likely to be a genuine divine artifact. Nick didn't find it strange that Salazar would have taken such an artifact, since the staff was said to have a serpent permanently coiled around it and fit his affinity for the creatures perfectly. Looking around the room, Nick frowned when he didn't see the staff anywhere amongst the treasures. The portrait scoffed when it saw this. Did you think I would leave a literal divine artifact behind when I was chased out of the castle? Everything here is merely that which I no longer had a use for but was too valuable to trade away. Don't look down on these things, though they were nearly unheard of even in my time, much less 1,000 years later. The portrait said arrogantly. You probably know where your likeness took the staff, don't you? Nick asked sternly. The portrait tugged at him. However, now why would I tell you that when you have no relation to me at all? It asked mockingly. It was abundantly clear that the portrait throwing a parroted version of Nick's own words earlier back in his face. Nick realized that the portrait was merely stringing him along to try and get what it wanted this entire time, and finally chose to ignore it and pack up the loot. The portrait wasn't lying about the rarity of this stuff either, as Nick couldn't directly identify 90% of it when he was storing it away. The 10% he did recognize were various valuable metals such as star metal, night iron, and even what looked like liquid gold in a bottle but was a stupidly rare metal known as God's blood. The reason for the name was that according to myth, when a god was wounded they bled golden blood. God's blood, however, was very much a metal, however that had nothing to do with gods at all, but rather was the result of a freak magical incident with as little as a 0.000000000000000000001% chance of happening. The stuff was the best metal for enchanting bar none, and was so valuable and rare that most people didn't even know it existed. Chapter 280, Loot, 2. Nick himself wouldn't have known about it had it not been for him seeing it in the system shop at a staggering 8 million points per drop. Looking at the vial of the stuff in his hand, Nick estimated there to be at least 10 drops worth of the stuff in it. This alone makes the trip worth it for me, but the rest of this stuff is just an added bonus. Nick said with a smile while the portrait was scowling angrily. You probably don't even know what that is, so your attempt at antagonizing me is pointless. The portrait scoffed. God's blood, and to be fair, I normally wouldn't know what it is, but I am a bit special in that regard. The things I can accomplish with this stuff gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. Nick said honestly. He wasn't joking either, since a single drop of this stuff was enough to create enchantments so complicated it may as well have been a runic reconstruction of every gene in a species' DNA. Though the enchanter would need to have the appropriate level of skill to accomplish such a thing to begin with. Tisk. It's not like I can stop you anyway, so fine, take everything and I hope you choke on your greed. The portrait said angrily. Nick chuckled but chose to ignore the portrait and focus on removing the curses attached to some of these items. The portrait grew more and more somber as it saw this, since it became clear to it that none of its likenesses trapped items were going to work. One needed to keep in mind that while not as skilled in the art of enchantment as Rowena Ravenclaw, Salazar Slytherin was still extremely skilled at it. Hiding curses from detection was a simple matter for him, and yet Nick was countering and removing the powerful dark curses easily. Are you a seer? How can you remove these curses with so little effort? The portrait couldn't help but ask, as it simply couldn't figure it out. Most seers had some sort of mental peculiarity that made them strange in conversation, yet Nick had none of that. Nick merely smirked while removing yet another curse and storing away the item it was attached to. For people like Salazar, mysteries were maddening things, so Nick's actions were driving the portrait nuts as it racked its mind for an answer. It couldn't come up with a single answer that made sense, however, and as a result could only grit its teeth in frustration. Soon enough Nick had packed away the various artifacts and materials and was moving on to the books as well. He could only shake his head at the many layers of curses on each of them that he had to strip off one by one. He could understand cautious, but this was getting ridiculous as there was way more than necessary in place on all this treasure. Amongst the books there was one that caught his attention, however, that was a journal bound in leather. Flipping it open, Nick was surprised to see that it was nothing less than a step-by-step guide to the perfected method of Horcruxes. Salazar was definitely correct in saying that it was dreadful even by his standards, as unlike the original Horcrux method that merely used murder and a ritual to create a Horcrux, this version burned the souls as fuel to slowly transfer one's own soul fully into an object while leaving a connection to the body. Yes, souls as in more than one at a time. Nick was disgusted by this information, as to burn souls in this way was to erase them from existence fully. It was heinous beyond measure, and only someone mad or totally without conscience would be willing to perform it. There is nothing worth knowing within these pages, Nick said, and used his ability to cover the book in his hand in violent flame, reducing it to ashes. I can't blame you for that decision, but that is so wasteful. Do you know how rare soul magic is? The portrait said, slightly regretful at the journal's destruction. Nick snorted and channeled his spiritual energy into his hand, making it glow for a brief instant before he stopped. The portrait had bulging eyes and a gaping mouth after seeing that. I know more about souls than you ever did, so don't talk to me about how rare it is. Nick replied scathingly. Necromancy? No, your spiritual energy was too pure for that, it is something else. The portrait started talking to itself in an attempt to figure out what Nick did. After storing away the last book, Nick turned back to the portrait with a vicious smile. Chapter 281, Salazar Slytherin. Now all that's left is to deal with you, Sir Portrait, or should I say Salazar Slytherin? Nick said mockingly, and the portrait took on a cold, arrogant expression. How did you figure me out? The founder asked calmly but with a slight menacing chill. I told you already, didn't I? I am more knowledgeable about souls than you ever were. That ritual of Herpo the Fowls leaves a permanent taint on the user's soul that anyone sensitive to spiritual energy could spot from miles away. It also didn't help that the magic used to animate portraits wasn't created until about a century after your disappearance from the school. Nick said with a mocking smile. Salazar snorted angrily and, much to Nick's amazement, stepped out of the portrait and stood before him in the flesh. It matters not, I suppose, since you won't be leaving this place alive. Salazar said as he pulled out a long wand from his robe that Nick recognized as a branch of the golden apple tree in the Ravenclaw vault. At first glance it looked like Slytherin had full mastery over it, but to Nick's magical senses it was a very different story. The wand was violently rejecting the Salazar, who had turned himself into little more than a lich at this point but was being suppressed by the man's massive mana. Oh yes, the founder had the most power out of anything Nick had ever encountered up to this point, and appeared like a blazing sun to his senses. Nick raised his wand, Lumos Mycere. He spoke, and Slytherin hissed angrily as Nick blinded him temporarily as an extremely bright burst of light exploded from the tip of Nick's wand. Finite. The founder roared but looked confused when his blindness didn't go away. Nick smirked and dashed to the side out of the way of a green spell from the founder, who silent cast it at his previous position. Nick pulled the Nazgul ring out of greed and tossed it past Slytherin, who had already recovered to a degree, and coldly mocked him for not even being able to aim right. Nick grinned viciously. Your projection isn't the target, he said, and it took the founder all of a split second to go pale and turn back to the portrait in a panic. No, he yelled angrily as the ring struck the portrait and immediately wrapped itself around it and went to work. He started screaming in agony as his projection began to unravel as his soul was being devoured by the ring. Nick watched on coldly as this happened, since he had been planning this moment since he discovered the true nature of the portrait. See, originally he had thought it was merely a cursed artifact that the actual founder left behind that was wrong somehow. But after reading the process of the perfected Horcruxes, he figured out what was wrong with it. It was a phylactery for Salazar Slytherin himself. From that moment on he started to set a trap for Slytherin to force him to use his projection, leaving his phylactery unprotected. Salazar Slytherin had nothing to blame for having his phylactery destroyed other than his own arrogance. Much like the diary soul shard, he had underestimated Nick far too much and paid the ultimate price for it. He couldn't be blamed though, since from the looks of things Nick had cheated to a large degree in order to kill the basilisk. Tying it down and have multiple roosters crow at the same time didn't really take much skill in magic after all. Unlike with the Horcruxes, it took quite a long time for the phylactery to be destroyed by the Nazgul ring, since it contained a complete soul. Some might think that this victory should have been impossible given Slytherin's power and experience, but in truth the man made several mistakes that lead to this outcome. The first was already mentioned, as his arrogance led to him underestimating Nick. The second was that his projection couldn't leave the painting for very long, as the ambient mana simply wasn't enough to support his existence. This meant that by placing his phylactery in such a location he had grown very rusty over the last 1,000 years, since there was no new knowledge available to learn. He had effectively trapped himself in the Chamber of Secrets until someone came along able to take his phylactery out. The third and final mistake he made was not considering that with his knowledge of souls Nick might have had a way to destroy his phylactery. All of these mistakes together had led to Salazar Slytherin meeting his end after 1,000 years at the hands of a second-year student. Chapter 282, Nazgul's Transformation. Finally the projection fully vanished as the ring devoured the final hints of the founder's soul, causing the portrait to turn to dust. Behind that portrait was another room that not only contained the staff but also a miniature library of clearly handwritten books. Checking a handful of them, Nick's eyes lit up as he found that they were all written by Slytherin himself to record his entire set of knowledge. They were so detailed that there was even entire tomes that no longer existed copied down verbatim in some books. This library may as well be a step-by-step guide to becoming as powerful as the founder himself. Nick thought with a wide grin. He chose to temporarily ignore the library, however, and focused on the old wooden staff that was carved to look like it had an actual serpent coiled around it. The serpent was so masterfully carved that other than age-related signs on the wood, Nick would have been convinced that it was an actual snake otherwise. His magical senses, however, were nearly blinded looking at the thing, as it was covered in dense complex enchantments via a style he was totally unfamiliar with. At first glance it looked almost like the Celebrimbor method of enchanting, in that the enchantments had been fused throughout the entire staff both inside and out, but there was no spiritual energy or intent involved, meaning it was totally different. It was fascinating to say the least, as he couldn't make heads or tails of the enchantments. The only reason he hadn't gotten a nosebleed of some sort like he had when looking at the Hogwarts Ward Stone was that unlike that object of power, the staff's enchantments flowed together smoothly rather than just sitting on top of the others discordantly. The difference was like listening to a fine-tuned orchestra versus a huge group of people all talking over each other. One was easy on the senses and the other stressed them considerably to try and decipher. WHUB. 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 A pulsing sound drew Nick out of his thoughts, however, and looking at its source he saw the Nazgul rings glow, pulsing in a rhythm. What's going on? He thought, confused as to what was happening. Soon the pulsing glow grew more and more intense and cracks began to appear on the ring, and Nick's eyes widened when he picked up a magical reaction around the glow. Magical beast birth phenomena. He thought, dumbfounded at what he was seeing before his very eyes. Nick had assumed that the ring would eventually gain a form of pseudo-life like the Elder Wand had, but he had never thought it would become an actual magical creature instead. While his brain was occupied with the significance of this event, the metal of the ring finally shattered. The shards didn't fly everywhere, however, but instead grew larger and turned into liquid that rapidly formed a metal shell around the raw glowing energy. Thump. 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 The sound of a heartbeat echoed throughout the area, and Nick felt the hair all over his body stand on end as the magical beast birth phenomena grew far more powerful than even when Norberto was born. Clearly whatever the Nazgul ring was turning into was of a higher life order than even a dragon, which made sense. Dragons were highly magical, but whatever the ring was becoming was born of pure unadulterated spiritual mana that had reached a critical point. Nick frowned, however, when he felt the life signs of the ring start to weaken, and he realized it had been overeager and didn't have enough energy to be born anew. Walking over to the metal shell the size of a basketball, he gently rested his hand on it and began to channel his spiritual energy into the egg. Slowly but surely the life signs grew stronger and stronger with this new infusion of spiritual energy, until something changed and Nick felt a connection form between his soul and the thing the ring was becoming. K-A-A-V. Crack. A loud bird call came from the egg, and a single crack appeared on it as bright light began to pour out from within it. Soon Nick watched as more and more cracks formed on the egg until with a loud boom, the egg exploded and the bright light temporarily blinded Nick. Once Nick's vision had returned, he saw the new magical creature standing before him and sucked in a breath of air in awe. It was a bird that had a body shape much like that of an eagle, except much smaller and narrower. It was covered in smooth shimmering black, white, and golden feathers from head to tail. Chapter 283, Nazgul's New Form. It had two sets of wings much like a thunderbird that were folded against its body at the moment, and four clawed bird feet that gave the form a griffin-like feel. That was where the avian features ended, however, as it had a long serpentine tail at the end of its body covered in feathers but ending in a familiar circular metallic ring. It also had a short neck that ended in a basilisk-like head that included the sharp horns, except that its mouth had a beak at the end. It was honestly one of the most eerily beautiful creatures Nick had ever seen. It was only the size of a house cat though, so it wasn't very intimidating at all, and Nick had no idea how big it was going to get. Chirp! Nazgul trilled happily as it started walking around clumsily, clearly not used to its new form. How in Merlin's saga beard am I supposed to explain you? Nick asked out loud while looking at the clumsy creature. Nazgul quirked its head adorably at the question in confusion before ignoring Nick. He was at a loss as to what to do, however, since he couldn't exactly hide Nazgul away due to his familiar bond to it. Unlike owning an owl or cat, in which case they could be away from their owners for long periods of time, and true familiar bond like that which Nick had with Nazgul meant it would be very bad for its health to be separated from him. This was also the reason that Fawkes is usually never far from Dumbledore for very long. When Nick willingly gave Nazgul his energy to complete its transformation, he had been familiar bonded to it, and now they were bound together on a spiritual level. Nick could only sigh and seal up Slytherin's library for later use, since this took priority. Once the library was sealed, he walked over to the newborn and scooped it up into his hands. Nazgul didn't resist, but rather snuggled up with a yawn and immediately went to sleep with its tail wrapped around Nick's arm. Dusk, who was flying about the chamber outside the statue's mouth, landed on the ground near Nick but was shivering in fear as it looked at Nazgul. It took Nick a few seconds to realize why Dusk was terrified of Nazgul. See, each of the immortal bird species would always be reborn after they died, either from old age or from being killed. However, if Nazgul still possessed the ability to devour souls, then there would be nothing to be reborn should it kill an immortal bird, as that immortal bird would lose its very soul. Such a thing was likely instinctively terrifying as far as an immortal bird like Dusk was concerned. At this point, Nazgul may as well embody the truest form of death possible, soul death. Calm down, mate, she won't hurt you, I promise. Nick said reassuringly, and Dusk relaxed a little but still refused to get near Nazgul at all. Helpless, Nick could only leave the Chamber of Secrets with Dusk following behind at a distance. As it turned out, it required yet another few miles of walking on the long pipe's wall to get out again. Moaning Myrtle took one look at Nazgul in Nick's arms and noped out of the bathroom immediately. Dusk immediately flew away once they left the chamber entirely, likely in an attempt to put as much distance between him and the sleeping Nazgul as possible without leaving the castle. Nick got more than a few of his fellow students, mostly girls, approach him to pet Nazgul, who didn't seem to mind the attention at all, while Nick himself was mentally sweating buckets. The small, soft, adorable creature in his arms could kill souls, so if she decided she didn't like a particular student for whatever reason. Yeah, bad stuff. Still, despite waking up mid-transit to Dumbledore's office, Nazgul seemed perfectly content to get carried around and petted like a pampered cat. Still, Nick made it to the gargoyle statue of the headmaster's office without any issue. "Sherbet Lemon," he spoke, and the statue moved aside. Dumbledore was surprised to see Nick so spontaneously, but moment Fawkes saw Nazgul he stiffened in fear, which the old wizard noticed through his bond with the bird. To his surprise, the elder wand in his sleeve also seemed terrified of the creature being held in one of his students' arms. "I feel like you have quite the story to tell me in regards to that creature you are holding," the old wizard said with a small chuckle to try and hide the uneasiness he felt at the fear that those two extremely powerful things held towards whatever that creature was. Chapter 284, Settling Matters. "You can both relax, she isn't likely to harm either of you," Nick said both to Dumbledore and Fawkes. The headmaster chose to trust Nick on this and relaxed visibly, while the phoenix looked much less like it believed him, though it did calm down considerably. Lord of Birds or not, he was holding what may as well be the Grim Reaper in his arms, so caution was well warranted. Nick took a seat across from Dumbledore and rested Nazgul on his lap, which she immediately sprawled out on leisurely, which made her seem totally innocent and peaceful. "I'm going to be blunt here, I have almost no idea what she is despite being familiar bound to her. I know what she was and how she was born, but I am at a loss as to what she is now beside terrifying," Nick said without sugarcoating anything at all. He then lifted up the end of Nazgul's tail to show the headmaster the ring at the end of it. For the first time Nick had ever seen, Dumbledore's eyes widened and his mouth gaped open in shock. Nick couldn't exactly blame the man, considering he basically just said he totally created a brand new life form. Nick decided to break down the process by which Nazgul turned into her current form from the beginning until now, without revealing the fact he had been feeding her soul pieces and most recently whole souls. Instead, he said she was merely accumulating more and more energy until she got enough to turn into her current form, which wasn't wrong. Dumbledore had a very serious expression by the end of Nick's explanation, while Fawkes seemed to have calmed down mostly. "I believe you, however this is a very serious matter, as it is very illegal to attempt to create new creatures," he said sternly. "With that said, it is clear that you had never intended for this outcome and are thus not going to get punished after this gets reported to the Ministry." Nick sighed in relief, since he really didn't want to go on the run due to Nazgul's accidental birth. The matter of it being familiar bonded to you complicates matters a bit, but I am sure that after a small probationary period you will have no trouble keeping it with you. Dumbledore laid it out seriously but kindly. She. Nick corrected, and Dumbledore chuckled. She it is then. You wouldn't happen to know any abilities she may have that might be good to know for the report, do you? He asked, and Nick shook his head. Honestly speaking, I have an idea, but I can't definitively say whether or not they are true. He said helplessly. It was true too, since until Nazgul showed off any abilities she might have he honestly wouldn't know. Even the ability to eat souls might have changed in some manner, he had no idea. System appraisal also didn't work on animals, so that idea was out. Dumbledore didn't seem surprised to hear this at all, since it was not unusual for new species to have unknown abilities. If that's all, I expect you ought to go introduce the little one to your friends. The old man said, and sent Nick out of the office. Looking over to Fawkes, he sighed. You couldn't by chance tell me what was so dangerous about that little thing, could you? He asked, and the reply he got back was a single concept, an idea if you would, death. Nick on the other hand was once again walking through the halls with Nazgul in his arms comfortably. It didn't take long for him to get to the workshop that was unlocked and occupied by his little group. Luna immediately lit up and rushed over, forcefully interrupting her duel with Harry the moment she saw Nazgul. Dusk was also in the room but was hiding behind the furnace nervously. Hello, aren't you just the cutest thing ever? Yes you are. Luna said while snatching Nazgul out of Nick's hands and giving her a spinning hug. I only took the other girls a heartbeat after that to follow suit and shower the newborn with affection. Nick looked at Steve. Looks like you aren't the cutest thing around me anymore, mate. He said with a chuckle, and Steve just looked confused. Anyone else going to notice out that the angry bird looks terrified of whatever that is? Ron pointed out how freaked out Dusk was of Nazgul. That got everyone's attention as they looked, and indeed Dusk was cowering away from the newborn fearfully. Now that you mention it, what even is this anyways? Tracy asked, confused. She is Nazgul and she is my familiar. As for species, it doesn't have a name since she is the first of her kind. Nick said while taking a seat to relax. Chapter 285, Attention. You know it's illegal to create new animals, right? Daphne asked with a small amount of worry. The law says it's illegal to do it on purpose, whereas she was about as accidental as it gets. That reminds me, for whatever reason, but don't make her mad or she might eat your soul. Nick said casually while all of his friends stiffened. Why am I not surprised that a creature you made, accidental or not, can eat souls of all things? Tracy asked with a sigh. To be fair, I'm not 100% certain on that ability since she had it as a ring, but as she is now there's no telling what she's capable of. Nick said with a shrug. He had long since accepted that his life was going to be strange beyond belief, so he was starting to get desensitized to crazy shit happening around him. Clearly his friends were right there next to him as they recovered from the shock of learning that the adorable monster they were cuddling could probably eat souls in a heartbeat. So basically she looks all cute and stuff but is probably ridiculously dangerous. Daphne asked for verification purposes. Yeah, that about summarizes it nicely. As a plus though, she seems too lazy to try and hurt people. Nick said with closed eyes. You know Hagrid's gonna lose his mind when he sees her. Man thought a dragon was cute even after it set his beard on fire. Ron said exasperated. I wonder if I should tell him about Aragog. Nah, no need to make him avoid Hagrid over something deep in the forest. Nick thought to himself with a chuckle. Zap. A loud sound like a small spark of electricity going off filled the air, and Nick felt a sudden weight on his lap. Opening his eyes, he was left speechless as Luna was sitting on his lap with a confused expression with Nazgul in her arms. What just happened? Nick asked, confused. She teleported in a bright flash of lightning. Harry said with wide eyes. Elemental teleportation, hey? That's handy. Nick said honestly. Luna slid off of his lap and complained, why are you so hard? She said while rubbing her backside. Nick nearly choked on his tongue when she said this, as his thoughts immediately went to a lewd place. Cough, I have a lot of muscle. He said with a bit of a blush. Nazgul wiggled out of Luna's arms and flapped her wings a few times to move through the air and crash into Nick's lap hard. He winced in pain at that but chuckled and scratched her on the top of the head. Need to work on your landing, little one, or I'm going to have a lot of bruises. He said with a chuckle. Luna looked heartbroken to be left by Nazgul but chose to grab Steve instead. The hefty Niffler was perfectly okay with that too. It took a while but Dusk slowly grew more comfortable with Nazgul after seeing she genuinely had no interest in him. No, she was far more interested in taking a nap with Nick on his reclining chair than anything else. Rather than continuing to bother Nick, his friends went back to what they were doing when he arrived earlier. For most the sound of crafting and dueling would be loud and impossible to sleep through, but for Nick it was a wonderful symphony lulling him to rest. He got shook awake a couple hours later by Harry since it was dinner time. Standing up with a yawn, Nick moved Nazgul into his left arm and left the workshop for the Great Hall. Dusk sat on one of his shoulders while the fat Steve stood on the other, making Nick look like he had too many creatures. Steve and Dusk were things everyone was used to seeing, but Nazgul drew quite a bit of attention. Nick set her the table in plain view of the entire Great Hall, where she, much like the other two magical beasts, ravaged the food on the long table. Nick was of course doing his damage to the food as well, but the beasts had him beat hands down. Hagrid at the professor's table looked like he wanted nothing more than to charge over and examine Nazgul in detail, while most of the other teachers had exasperated looks. It was bad enough having to deal with a Ho-Ho and a Niffler, but now they whatever this thing was as well. Still, there was nothing they could do about it, as the Ho-Ho had a bad temper, making it untouchable, and the Niffler was practically adored by the majority of the female population in the castle. This new thing though was apparently familiar bound to Nick, so they absolutely couldn't do anything to it. Familiars were sacred things in wizarding culture, so acting against them would have the entire community breathing down one's neck. Chapter 286, Red Tape. Nick spent the next few days dealing with the bureaucratic nightmare that was registering a new species, verifying his familiar status with Nazgul, having interviews with several overeager magi zoology papers, receiving hundreds of letters requesting the privilege to study Nazgul from various different wizards globally, and then all his schoolwork as well. Needless to say, he was mentally exhausted by the time the weekend came again. He had discovered a few new things about Nazgul's magical abilities over the last week, as well as she occasionally showed off something new. The first thing he verified was that she does still eat souls, though the energy doesn't get passed to him afterwards. Instead, she stores it within her body to fuel both her growth and another magical ability. Nick had been steadily feeding her the souls of insects, fish, toads, and rats to help her stock up on energy since he discovered this. Obviously those souls didn't give a lot of energy, but it was better than nothing in his opinion. Still, all that energy let her grow considerably, so Nazgul is currently the size of a medium-sized dog breed like a Shiba. Nick had also discovered that she had an innate ability to freely manipulate spiritual energy in a manner nearly identical to the way he himself does. The biggest difference was that she was leagues better at it than he was, with a 100% efficiency compared to his roughly 73% efficiency. Nick was more than a little jealous, to say the least, but chose to swallow his jealousy. She also had an ability that he identified its source immediately due to its uniqueness. She could kill or petrify with a single look if she wanted to, as Nick had learned when she killed a feral rat with the ability. The ability was thankfully active instead of passive like in the case of the basilisk, so she had full control over it. The most valuable magical ability though, in Nick's opinion, was a type of fire she could create using her stores of spiritual energy. According to the system, it was known as Purgatory Fire and was one of the only 3 spiritual flames in existence besides Hell Fire and Holy Fire. The system shop had a seed of the stuff listed at a staggering 50 billion points, making it stupid expensive. Despite that, however, he couldn't cheat and feed a seed to the system for a bunch of points, as the system refused to take it. Still, he wasn't too upset about it, since he could simply add it to his furnace and use it for his forging, which he did. Other than that, he hadn't seen any other magical abilities from Nazgul other than that. Peeves, on the other hand, learned the hard way that pranking her was a bad idea and was now terrified of her. Despite being immortal and thus unkillable via most methods, Nazgul directly attacked his ghostly body and tore his essence apart. He regenerated after a couple days, but the memory of the pain it brought him was enough to make the poltergeist give Nick's group a very wide berth. Nick hadn't forgotten the previous attack on Dusk, but had been far too busy to focus on Peeves, so this worked out great. There was no point in killing the poltergeist anyways, as another would be created by the end of the year due to the chaotic energy of the student population. Waking up on Saturday after sleeping in a bit, Nick got dressed and woke up Nazgul as well. She yawned and stretched out on the bed that she insisted she sleep in before walking next to Nick as he left the dorm. Today was the opening match of the Quidditch season at Hogwarts between Gryffindor and Slytherin, so Nick and his friends were going to cheer Harry on. "You slept in rather late today, it seems," Hermione noted as he walked into the common room. "It's been an exhausting week and I needed the sleep," Nick said with a shrug. "Just remember not to get lazy like the Ron or Harry," she said sternly. "Yawn, we aren't lazy, classes are just boring is all," Ron said with a tired yawn as he and Harry came down from the boys' dorm stairway. "He's not wrong, you know, I mean look at how much effort he puts into woodworking. He's quickly catching up to me, and I was taught by Ollivander himself," Nick said, taking Ron's side. Hermione huffed but didn't argue, since Nick was right about how much progress Ron was making. The only real trouble Ron was having at the moment was getting the runes and wand opening charm down. Chapter 287, Always Trouble. Once he gets past that point though, Ron was basically already set to make wands on his own. So how confident are you in winning against Slytherin with their whole team outfitted with new brooms? Nick asked Harry casually. My Nimbus is only slightly worse than the new model they have, so I can keep up with Malfoy, but the rest of the team is a problem. I'll be rough on them, to be honest. Harry said seriously. I imagine it will be, but we know for a fact that Gryffindor teams trained much harder than the Slytherin thanks to Daphne and Tracy. Nick pointed out, and Harry nodded in agreement. Oliver Wood had gone absolutely nuts on training this year after tryouts, so the entire team was in peak shape for the game. It wasn't known outside the Gryffindor team, but the twins had been making money hand over fist selling the workout potions to the team. This meant that the whole team had far more bang for their buck for all that intense training they did. This was going to be a very nasty surprise for the Slytherin team, who was only slightly in shape since schoolwork took up most of their time. The group made their way over to the Great Hall and ate breakfast before heading over to the pitch where Harry left them for the locker room. It was a slightly cloudy day with a bit of a chill in the air that had them bundle up with scarves. When the balls were released at the start of the game, Nick frowned as he felt a foreign magic latch onto one of the bludgers that then targeted Harry. Why is he still causing trouble? The chamber is not a threat anymore, he thought before excusing himself from the pitch to track down Dobby. The elf wasn't hard to find at all as he was manipulating the bludger from under one of the empty bleachers nearby. Sneaking up on the hyper-focused elf, Nick pointed his wand at Dobby's back from up close. Stupefy, he said, and Dobby didn't have any time to react before it was lights out. Using his magical senses, Nick quickly found the slave binding to the Malfoy family thanks to Draco being nearby and directly cut it off, freeing Dobby. Countering magic was easy when Nick had time to feel it out, since he just needed to send a pulse of opposite frequency magic at it, and this was no different. Renervate. He spoke calmly and Dobby immediately regained consciousness but seemed in disbelief almost immediately afterwards. Yes, I freed you, now explain why you are still attacking Harry even though I have already gotten rid of the diary and the monster in the Chamber of Secrets. Nick asked sternly. The book is gone? And the monster? Dobby questioned with wide disbelieving eyes. Nick rolled his eyes. If you had bothered to check, you would already know about the diary being taken care of, meaning Lucius's plan had already failed. He said impatiently. How does Sir know of these things? Dobby asked, horribly confused. I know about the diary because the foolish thing tried to attack me, and as for Lucius's involvement, simple deduction really. Anything else, or is that enough to satisfy you? Nick asked in irritation. It would have taken Dobby maybe 2 seconds tops to check on Ginny and see that the diary was completely inert, yet had instead stubbornly tried to get Harry out of Hogwarts again. He had good intentions, but it still irritated Nick to no end that he needed to set the elf right. Once that nonsense was dealt with, Nick returned to the rest of his friends just in time to see Fred and George making themselves nuisances with the bludgers. Thanks to their great bodies, they had developed a strategy that involved volleying the balls between them and flying an opponent into the crossfire. Harry didn't even get the chance to catch the snitch since the twins crippled both the Slytherin team's chasers, ending the game with Gryffindor's victory. It was a rule that the game ended when no one could fill a position on a team due to injury. Was it frowned upon to win like that? Yep. Did the twins care? Not even a little. Oliver Wood didn't care either since they had won, but the Slytherin captain Marcus Flint was beyond furious and even almost started throwing curses. Seeing as the game was over, Nick snatched the snitch out of the air with a thread of fire before handing it over to Madame Hooch to put away. Oliver Wood looked like he died a little inside when he saw that, while Marcus Flint felt relief that Nick wasn't playing against them. Chapter 288, Trouble Child. Dumbledore POV. I had hoped that over time Nick would slowly mellow out and not cause so many problems, but that simply hadn't happened. Not exactly how I had hoped anyways, as he did indeed become less reserved and now spent a great deal of time amongst those he calls friends, but he was arrogant in how he seemed to view the world now. The sort of prideful and vengeful attitude I would expect from a phoenix or ho-ho, in fact. He isn't unkind or anything like that, but he simply ignores anyone outside his circle. Add on his rapidly improving prowess in magic and the boy is rapidly shaping up in a very familiar manner to myself when I was younger. Thankfully, unlike my younger self, he has a fairly clear moral code and refuses to cross some lines. The imprint on the school's ward stone was proof enough of this. If he dabbled in dark magic in the pursuit of power like I did when I was younger, the dark would taint his imprint to some degree, and yet there was nothing, not a single drop. I was both eager and worried about what the future under him will look like as a result. Everything that made Gellert and I great was found in the boy, but there was also negative points as well. He was charismatic, powerful, attractive, and skilled in magic, but he was also proud, ambitious and burdensomely gifted with many magical abilities. The last one doesn't seem like a negative point, but people grow the most under pressure, and with so many abilities at his beck and call, the boy can casually coast his way to glory. He simply can't find the pressure needed to grow as an individual. This was why I was surprised to learn that he was teaching his friends his knowledge. It was out of character. The boy was many things, but charitable was definitely not one of them, and yet I can't figure out why he was suddenly deciding to do this. It was almost as if he was suddenly subjected to an extremely heavy pressure and was trying his hardest to adapt. The thought that he may have figured out what Gellert's sacrifices were for crossed my mind, but I had only barely discovered their purpose myself after much effort. In the end I decided to just accept this good news and focus on the newest headache Nick had given me. Just this morning I had received a letter from Gringotts telling me that one Harold Rich had donated a staggering 200,000 galleons to Hogwarts for class expenses and wages. This act had Nico's fingerprints all over it, and I quickly pieced together why he had done this as well. It's not a common thing to have someone come into my office and have Fawkes personally deliver a letter to Nico after all. Yes, the boy hadn't even tried to hide what he was doing from me, but was completely obvious about it. I could only sigh and accept this donation, since as much as I am loath to admit it, the funds were desperately needed. The only other person aware of exactly how close to bankruptcy Hogwarts was Minerva. She had long been helping me manage the various legal aspects of the school, and thus knew just how badly the Dada curse had sapped away the school's funds. It was for this reason that I had to reject Phileas's proposal for crafting classes beyond the rare alchemy class I teach if demand is high enough. Now, though the school is totally recovered thanks to the sudden injection of funds that brought us back to full capacity, I owe it all to that stubborn child who refused to accept lack of funds as an excuse. It was an odd feeling for me to be grateful for one of my own students being a troublesome individual, but here I am. My current greatest concern is not with Nick, but rather Gellert and the repercussions of what he intends to do. It was unpleasant, but I had warned the various ministries of the world what he sought to accomplish not long ago. Few have noticed it, but each ministry is slowly bracing itself for the massive war that the whole world will soon be embroiled in. I used arithmancy to determine the amount of time we have left to stop Gellert and came to the answer of almost 3 years. If we fail to stop him in that time span, the entire world will be flooded with magic, ruining centuries of the Muggles' hard work and ousting wizarding kind from hiding by force. The predicted death toll was a staggering 3.5 billion lives as the Muggles' society collapses and wizards are forced out into the open. Chapter 289, Ministry Preparations. Nick did not know that the secret of Grindelwald's plan had basically been revealed to everyone who needed to know at this point, but he would be happy if he did. In fact, he would be thrilled at that fact, since it would explain why Arthur Weasley had all allegations against him dropped at the Ministry. Nick assumed that it may have been due to the goodwill the Weasley family earned because of the capture of Pettigrew. If he knew about this leak of Grindelwald's plan, however, it would change his thoughts entirely. After all, why would the Ministry punish Arthur for the magical car when it may be the last functional car on the planet in the next few years? Instead, the Ministry had encouraged Arthur to disclose his car's enchantments so they could secretly try and fill the Muggles' vehicles with them. It wasn't much, but the Ministry hoped it would lower the death toll at least a little. There was one tiny little hiccup in that plan, however, in the form of Arthur not actually knowing the enchantment by heart. See, he had been very secretive when doing the enchantments and thus didn't write them down, meaning he simply didn't know what they were by heart. It was like writing a long essay for school and then being asked to recite it verbatim without having it in front of you. Most people would fail at it. This, funnily enough, led to the Ministry trying to track down the vehicle in the Forbidden Forest for the last week. It was only at this point that the Ministry learned the true extent of what all lived within its bounds after several Aurors were attacked by various unfriendly creatures, including Acromantulas. They found the car though and managed to extract it from the forest semi-safely. It didn't show up in the paper, but the whole school was aware of it since the Aurors had fled the forest with the car in the middle of the day, making quite the commotion when they did. 3 of them even had to be treated by Madame Pomfrey for Acromantula poisoning. Nick knew that the car had gone wild in the forest, but didn't know that it had also decided to take up residence in the Acromantula territory. It was only after sneakily eavesdropping on the Aurors' conversations that Nick learned why they were after the car. The Ministry wants to replicate the enchantments on the car. Why? The information confused him greatly, as he simply couldn't understand it at all. Even stranger was how, despite the sheer amount of purebloods in the Ministry, they weren't throwing a huge fit over something as major as this. It was more than a little suspicious, to say the least. Still, he decided it wasn't any of his business what strange ideas the people at the Ministry came up with and ignored the matter. Instead, he was far more interested in his most recent treasure, the Staff of Asclepius. Staff, Snakewood / Hydra Heartstring. Grade, Legendary. Abilities, Poison Synthesis, Poison Immunity, Parcel Tongue, Healing Affinity, Hag's Blessing, Mana Focus, Medicine Domain. Mythical ability, Healer's Blessing. Once a day the wielder can return an unhealthy person to peak health regardless of the severity of their injuries or diseases. Legendary ability, Life Restoration. Once every 10 years a single person below the Tier 2 power level can be brought back to life so long as they have been dead no longer than 3 days. Needless to say, Nick was very interested in the staff after seeing this appraisal from the system. It certainly lived up to the hype of being a divine item. How could it not when it literally allowed someone to be resurrected with fairly easy to fulfill requirements? The staff also perfectly fit the description of Asclepius perfectly with all of its abilities. With poison synthesis one could on the spot generate any sort of medicine by diluting the poison to a helpful level. The fact that the staff also gave Parseltongue fit since according to mythology the god learned from a snake the secrets of the medicinal arts. Nick had also finally learned what grade was past mythical thanks to this staff, so he knew what he needed to shoot for now. Till now he hadn't made a single mythical item because he didn't know how exactly, but after comparing this staff with his wand that was mythical he had a rough idea. Mythical items were actually not much different from high-end rare grade items except one difference, the ability. In order to be classified as a mythical item the thing needed to both have a certain level of complexity as well as a single transcendent ability that doesn't necessarily need to be related to the other normal abilities. Chapter 290, Mythical Ring. With this information Nick intended to create his first mythical item, but he didn't want to half-ass it and get a barely good enough product. With that in mind he knew exactly what his first mythical ring was going to be since it had been bothering him for quite some time now. He was going to create a far better version of greed that was all around improved. It wouldn't even be all that hard to accomplish either since the original greed enchantment has a vast amount of room for improvement. Nick had several very large pieces of metal sitting in front of him that he needed to melt down to form the new greed's base form. Mithril, adamantium, orichalcum, goblin silver, god's blood, star metal, water bronze, fire gold, cloud iron, and timonium. In this selection was a few of the metals he retrieved from Slytherin's hoard in the Chamber of Secrets. With them added in, Nick included all 4 base elements as well as both space and time, and even painstakingly chose to part with a drop of god's blood to push the enchantment to its absolute limit according to his ability. Nick had waited until after he was dismissed from class on Friday and locked himself in the workshop with Helena and Flitwick because he will need both of their help for this particular venture. He had taken into consideration how long it would take him to complete this ring, and including resting to replenish his energy it will take no less than 2.5 days. Helena and Flitwick's role during this time was to ensure that the enchantment never stabilized as he restored his energy. If it ever did he would be forced to start over again, ruining all his previous work. Flitwick and Helena were both informed of this and thus were extremely serious as they waited for Nick to begin. First he cranked on the furnace and switched it over to conjunction fire since greed was always meant to be a storage space first and foremost. Nick then started to place each and every metal in the furnace to melt. The metal in the furnace boiled and rumbled before every type of metal finally liquefied, and Nick wasted no time throwing the single drop of god's blood into the mixture and pointing his wand at it. Rumenya kanana goyana nua. He spoke in glowing gold. White and green mist sank into the liquid metal from the tip of his wand. The liquid began to swirl violently in the center, and soon the various colors of the different metals fused together before vanishing. Nick hurriedly removed this new metal liquid from the furnace and sent it into a large mold he had prepared beforehand. It was an open face mold in the shape of a huge ring, so it contained the roughly gallon of liquid metal without issue. While they waited for the metal to solidify, Nick turned off the furnace and took out a whole loaf of lembas bread. Nick ate the entire thing after the metal showed signs of turning solid and stood tall as he closely watched the mold. His stomach began to hurt a bit from the dense amount of nutrients within the loaf of bread, but he ignored it since the metal had cooled into shape. He removed the mold using transfiguration and placed the glowing black metal ring on his anvil. He switched over to his hammer and began to channel his spiritual energy with the intent and knowledge of greed's enchantment, but far stronger and more in-depth. He poured all his knowledge of Boggots, space, time, and the world into his spiritual energy and slammed his hammer down onto the black ring. Boom! A loud shockwave of energy exploded from the ring in a rainbow light but passed harmlessly through everything. The black ring morphed immediately into the ring-like but amorphous visage that greed normally had. Nick wasn't surprised considering he had injected majority of his energy into this single step of the process. Helena took the first shift, keeping the ring's enchantment unstable while Nick sat down and meditated to restore his energy faster. 2 hours later, when he finished, he stood up and approached the anvil again whilst holding his hammer. This time he began to channel his energy with the intent of fire and the roles it plays in the world. His glow turned red and violent like the element he was imbuing into it before he struck the ever-shifting ring the moment Helena removed her influence on it. Nar Runya Uraloki Anar. Fire. Flames, volcano, sun, he spoke, and the energy radiating off of him seemed to gain actual substance as a wave of heat rose from him and dried out the air of the workshop.